Hi, welcome back, guys. This is your friend Caller What If with another fiction. What if female Deku all of one's decision that the quirk were useless now? Before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. If you more want video like this, now let's get into the fanfic. After living for so long and amassing so many quirks, All for One had come to realize something. Quirks were useless. A quirk could not truly define a person or guarantee their safety or happiness. That was up to the individual. All for One had come to face this reality only recently. Over his lifetime, he had seen the people become gluttonous and greedy with their power. Over the centuries, he had watched an imbalance arise. Those with half-decent quirks had a leg up on those who had bad ones, or even worse, no quirk at all. But, like all privileges, quirks were no indication of a person's heart or intellect or true human skill. It was entirely juvenile in his eyes. Under his hands, quirks were like water, mere tools that could be adjusted or exchanged. Yet, perhaps most ironically, the time had come to recognize that not even the most miraculous combination of such almighty quirks could keep him from his fate. In the years that he had spent hidden away, clawing his way to a recovery from wounds that now sewed a slow end to his life, this society that had grown around him broken and twisted. It had given guns to fools and told them to shoot at whatever moved, placing heroes onto pedestals and pointing at villains as the scum of the earth. In some ways, he envied the quirkless. They were not dependent on these social crutches. They advanced by their own strength. It was these few who society should honor, to who this fantastical commodity should truly belong. He was amongst these thoughts when on an afternoon stroll through the streets of an urban neighborhood, savoring his few remaining days of mobility to experience the streets and the people, when he stumbled upon a group of children at a park. For he knew that his health would not hold for much longer. Even if he still had 10 years to live, they would all be spent bedridden, and so these few months would be one of his few opportunities to see the outside world. Most people would have traveled, seen all they could, if they found out that their days were numbered, but not him. He had had a few hundred years to see the world and its treasures. So, instead, he preferred to take in the common people as they lived their lives. It was, however, a pity that none could truly know him. Only the illusion he gave them of an unremarkable salaryman in a cheap suit. A useful quirk that he had picked up some years ago. For he was scarred beyond recognition, his whole face reduced to mottled flesh such that he could not see through his own eyes. Instead, he had another quirk for that. These children who played in the park were small, probably only 7 or 8 years old. At first glance, he had thought that there were only 3 of them, since the quirk he was using to see primarily was intended to recognize quirks. But then he looked closer. They were huddled around something, shouting and kicking at it. The kid who visibly led the group, the one with the explosion quirk, was shouting especially loud and letting out threatening explosions from his hands. That's when the boys shifted, and All for One saw what they had been jeering at. A girl with short green hair, curled up in the fetal position and crying violently on the floor. The small boy with the explosive quirk called out louder, so that All for One could hear him now. "You're useless, Deku. A purely useless Deku. You'll never be anything." The other 2 kids parroted the first boy. "Yeah, useless. You'll never be anything. You don't even have a fucking quirk," the first boy said before landing a vicious kick to his victim. The girl didn't respond, except to tighten her shield of limbs. So the 4th child was quirkless. It had been some time since he had seen a quirkless child. Less and less of them were being born, and so most of those he encountered were adults, and had for the most part figured themselves a place in this quirk-filled world. So, of course, most of the adults operated just fine, but children were a different ball game. They were especially vulnerable at an age in which quirks were new and exciting, and a determining factor for their position amongst their peers. All for One should have kept walking. This was not his concern. The children could sort themselves out. Yet he could not tear his gaze away from the kicking and jeering. and that small thing curled against the blows. Before he could stop himself, he was striding through the gate at the edge of the park. Hey, you three. What was he doing? He was above such hasty flights of fancy. Yet, surely he could afford some harmless good on his ledger. Ah, an adult. One of the kids howled in surprise. The blonde one landed one last kick before they all turned to stare at him with wide eyes. Two of them swallowed nervously and looked to the boy with the explosive quirk for a signal. He must have been their leader, for he glared brazenly at all for one with beady red eyes, before he gave a grunt and a "let's get out of here." Then they shot the girl a withering glare and trudged off to the street. It's okay now, all for one said. Those three are gone. The girl on the floor peeked her head up and looked around to confirm that her aggressors were indeed gone. She wiped her snot and tears on her dirty pants before turning her big, curious green eyes towards her benefactor. Why did you stop them? She asked with a sniff. He paused, unsure himself, before settling into a smile. I just had a moment to spare. Her curiosity turned to suspicion. Clearly no one else had had a moment to spare. What do you want with me? She said skeptically. All for one chuckled. Nothing at all. I suppose that I was just curious. He paused for a moment. Why didn't you try to defend yourself? The girl's green eyes turned bitter, and she looked away from him in defeat. I gave up on fighting them. I'm not strong enough. Not strong enough? Why is that? She wrapped her little arms around her little knees and squeezed them towards her chest, as if that would protect her from judgment. I'm quirkless, useless. And? The girl looked up in surprise. This was a fact of immense consequence. There was no and about it. All for one couldn't help but chuckle. Find a way to protect yourself, child. This is not all you are. You can still grow into someone amazing. You know, my brother was born quirkless, just like you. Granted, we had a few disagreements, but ultimately he became a great symbol and left a legacy of hope and ambition. A hero. Was he a hero? Her face was alight with such wonder that he could not bring himself to show her the absolute hate that twisted in his gut. She leaned forwards eagerly. Are you saying that I can become a hero? Someone like All Might? Him. All for one's smile flinched, just barely. Of course she had to mention him. Perhaps in your own way. But forget quirks. What's important is what's up here, he said, tapping his temple. Today, flashy quirks are a dime a dozen. But what really makes someone stand out is what they can do with their skills. The girl watched him with big eyes, full of wonder, as if she were ingraining this moment in her memory. Suddenly a voice called for him from the edge of the park. Sir, what are you doing here? Kurogiri stood by the gate. His voice was stiff with disbelief and his jaw was practically hanging open in surprise. He must have been quite the sight for his underling. The horrible, terrifying villain All for One, a legend who haunted the nightmares of the proudest heroes, was sitting in a park comforting a beaten little girl. The thought brought a smile of amusement to his lips as he savored the unusual moment. Ah, I am just keeping this young woman company. Who? Well, boss, Kurogiri began, evidently at a loss for words. I thought that you would be home. I'm afraid that we have a meeting later today. You can't miss it. My friend is right. I have to be going. All for One said with an apologetic smile. I guess that this is goodbye, little miss. Wait. The little girl blurted out suddenly, scrambling to her feet. My name's not Little Miss, it's Chisaki. Chisaki Midoriya. The girl's eyes were filled with an excited determination and a bright smile was on her lips. I heard that you're supposed to introduce yourself to new friends. All for One looked down in astonishment, and he was sure that Kurogiri's eyes were just about to pop out of his eye sockets at the brazen display of familiarity to his boss. It was almost hard to believe that this same child had been crying and hurt only minutes before. How amusing. All for one smiled slowly at her innocence. Very well then, Chisaki Midoriya. You may call me sensei. Chisaki rolled over in her bed and looked at her clock. Its light temporarily blinded her tired eyes as she read its display. Only 2 in the morning. She let loose a sigh into the empty room. It was shaping up to be another sleepless night. Her eyes scanned the walls and their familiar All Might posters. Her dreams screamed at her from the back of her mind, and thoughts drifted through her head, as they often did during these nights, and served only to distance that elusive sleep. A memory, like a video that she had seen thousands of times, played itself in her mind. A smile found its way to her lips as her mind ran its usual loop. She was at the park when she was 7 or so. It was an average day. Kachon and his usual friends had been there, doing what they always did. Then a man walked up and scared Kachon and his friends off. He had spoken with her only briefly, but she had long since memorized every word that strange man had uttered and every intonation or movement the man had made. She had known that she would likely never see this man again. But his words had sparked in her that indelible desire to become a hero, to stand like All Might and show the world that everything was going to be okay. Of course, people had been dubious of her. People made fun of her behind her back, or even told her blatantly that it was impossible. There were even people like Kachin who seemed to think that it was their place to physically dissuade her. And yet it was no secret that she was still striving for that same dream. Chisaki reached behind her clock and picked up a worn notebook, reading its title in the clock's pale light. For the future. Hero Analysis #13. A warm smile lit her face in that dark room. This was her dream, and she was going to pursue it, no matter what. Later that same day, for it was properly day now, she sat at school. The homeroom of her 8th grade class had been running like usual, the teacher droning on about some school activities or upcoming events. Chisaki never had much interest in those things. Seeing these people at school was enough for her. She didn't need to see them more often than necessary. Besides, it was common knowledge that none of them particularly liked her. They considered her bookish, awkward, and unsociable. Suddenly, something the teacher had said caught her attention. "I have the forms for the high school applications here," the man said, holding up a stack of papers and waving them around. Chisaki glanced around the room at the repeated expressions of excitement and anticipation. "Now, I know that many of you want to apply to UA," to which the whole class roared in approval, and chaos ensued as everyone activated their quirks simultaneously, as if trying to prove that they all deserved to be in UA. Chisaki just held her hand up timidly. The teacher cleared his throat and waited for the chaos to die down a little bit. "But how many of you are planning to actually apply and hope to get in?" Every hand remained raised, including Chisaki's. "What the fuck are you all talking about?" Katsuki Bakugo roared angrily, his feet flung off from where they had been propped up on the desk, as he stood and shot his vicious glare around the room. "Put your hands down, you fucking extras. I'm going to be the only one applying to UA." A murmur of uncertainty ran through the class. Hands started dropping, and worried and accusing glances shot around like bullets. Bakugo's status as the strongest, most violent, and most promising student in the year had cemented him as an untouchable and omnipotent existence in the classroom. He was known for going after anyone who disagreed with him and setting his usual posy of able quirk user friends to crush any spirit that rose against him. And yet, Chisaki had remained as this existence apart from the mob mentality of the class. She stood up to Bakugo despite her fear of him. Most people thought that she must have been mentally stunted to dare defy Katsuki Bakugo, an existence who even the teachers hesitated to touch. And so there she sat, hand raised, when everyone else had dropped theirs. She would stand for her dream. If this wasn't the moment to pursue her dream of becoming a hero by going to UA, then there would never be a moment. "Put your hand down." Bakugo's grating voice came from behind her. His tone was low and deadly. She felt a chill run up her spine. He only used this tone when he meant business, and it carried with it an unsaid threat. She kept her right hand raised. Her left clutched her hero notebook in a vice grip on the desk. Then the bell rang, a shrill noise which made Chisaki jump in surprise. Well, I'll be seeing you all again on Monday," the teacher concluded awkwardly. He gave a forced smile before sweeping from the room in a quick motion. Reminiscent, Chisaki thought, of a villain fleeing the scene of a crime. Around her, students stood and rushed hurriedly to the doors, desperate to escape the tensely charged atmosphere of the classroom. Before Chisaki could rise and do the same, a hand clamped violently onto her shoulder, keeping her in her seat. Bakugo strode into her field of view, two of his lackeys standing at either side. His eyes were like little embers, glaring at her as if his gaze alone should have been able to burn a hole through her. "What the fuck was that, Deku?" he asked as he leaned forward, staring into her green eyes maliciously. She looked away and instead opted to plant her gaze on her desk. "What was what? Catch on?" she asked quietly. "You know what I'm talking about. That stupid display of yours." "Why the fuck do you think that you can challenge me?" he snapped. She said nothing and focused on keeping her hands from shaking. Bakugo's eyes narrowed, and he looked down to where her gaze was trained. He grinned when he saw her clutching her notebook. "What is this piece of trash?" he asked, snatching it from her grasp. "For the future. Hero analysis #13. "What is this bull crap?" he exclaimed, laughing hysterically. "And you've got another 12 of these pieces of garbage?" His lackeys joined him in laughing at her, while Bakugo opened the unassuming notebook and flipped to a random page. He scanned it for a moment. "It's just a bunch of stupid hero nerd crap." He looked up at her big eyes, which now watched him in horror. They both knew what he was going to do next. Bakugo gripped a dozen or so pages and ripped them out violently, letting the fistful of pages fall to the ground. Her heart leapt into her throat. He just sneered at her as the shredded pages fluttered from his hands. "Deku, you really are a stupid, obsessive fangirl." Her eyes stung as she watched those bottomless hours of hard work fall to the grimy floor. Now nothing more than scrap. "Oh, are you going to start crying now?" He turned to one of his lackeys. "Look at her. We tear up her precious little notebook, and she's going to start bawling like a toddler." Rage rose up inside her, and she pooled all of her self-pity into it in the face of this injustice. She stood sharply, knocking her chair back. "Give that back to me, right now, Bakugo." The three of them stared at her for a moment, stunned. Then they doubled over, laughing. "Oh God," one of the lackeys exclaimed. "Was that supposed to be intimidating?" the other said, as he gasped for air. "Is the poor, little, quirkless Deku going to make me give back this notebook?" Bakugo asked with a smirk. "Well, you know what? I'm feeling generous today. You can have your book back." He paused for a moment and watched her glare at him. "But you're going to have to go and collect it from the fishes," he said with a grin. A protest died in Chisaki's throat with a wimpy little yelp, as she watched Bakugo release a series of explosions on the book. He shot her a knowing look before chucking the now charred projectile through the window. Chisaki heard it land in the fish pond with a distant splash. A hole opened up in her chest and her breath caught there, shallow and weak. Her heart and soul had gone into that book. So much love and care had just been obliterated because this massive prick wanted to make her suffer. A hand landed on her shoulder, and she looked up to see Bakugo's wolfish smile. "You see, I'm going to be a hero, and I can't have someone like you staining my coattails. So, why don't you forget about getting into UA, you shitty nerd?" he said with that cold and deadly tone, before setting off a series of explosions on her shoulder, a trail of smoke coiling from under his hand. This was not a suggestion, but a command. "Good. I think she understands." Bakugo removed his hand from her shoulder and turned to his lackeys with a triumphant grin. "Let's go. I want to stop at the arcade on the way home." That sounds like fun, one of the lackeys said, trailing after Bakugo as he made his way to the door of the classroom. The last lackey gave her a little smirk before he left. That's really pitiful. Can't even say anything back. Come on, Bakugo commanded sharply from the doorway. When they were all gone, Chisaki let her tears fall. She felt so fucking useless. God damn it. Why couldn't they just leave her be? She swiped at her cheeks as she trudged miserably down the stairs and out to the front of the school. All I wanted was to be a hero. It's not my fault that I was born quirkless, she thought as she walked up to the fish pond and stared down at her notebook drifting in the water. I don't want to be this weak. I want to be a hero. Someone like All Might. She picked up the book gingerly, watching the water fall in a hypnotic little stream from the soaked and charred pages. Furious tears burned in her eyes. I want to inspire people and make them feel safe. I want to be a hero so that I can stop people like Kachin, so that no one has to be pushed around by someone who calls themselves a hero. She cradled her poor book in her arms and began her lonely trek home, deliberately trudging the long way in order to avoid the busy center of the city, where the arcades were. She didn't want to run the risk of running into Bakugo again. Her thoughts continued to swirl. Why? Why is this world so cruel? If I had been born with a quirk, I would at least stand a chance against people like Kachan. I would have a real shot at being a hero. Ha! Who have I been kidding? I've had my heart set on this stupid dream of being a hero for so long, and I can't even stand up for myself, as a normal citizen. If it's going to be people like Kachan standing over me the rest of my life, because I can't get over my own egoism, then I would rather give up now. Maybe if I just go to a normal high school, I can still avoid this whole mess and still salvage some of my school life. Maybe even have some friends. How novel. Friends, ha one. Chisaki's feet carried her towards a cement tunnel, over which passed a bland, ordinary street. Nobody supported me in my dream of being a hero anyways. Just my mom and some stranger, who I'll probably never see again. She entered the tunnel. It was dark and damp, and smelled of something rotten. She was too lost in thought to notice a sewage grate shifting by her feet. I mean, not even my teachers would even acknowledge that I wanted to be a hero. They have always skirted around the subject, as if by ignoring it, they could make it disappear. They won't even help me when I mention that I'm being bullied by their star student. This whole thing is just... A mass of green liquid shot up from behind her and crashed down over her head. It was cold and thick, and the gasp of shock that rose in her throat was all the air she got before it engulfed her. A voice, thick and slimy like the sludge that lifted her kicking feet from the floor, reverberated in the muck. It'll be all right, little girl. I just need to borrow your body for a minute. You see, I've got some pesky heroes chasing after me. I'm sure you understand. The sludge, it could speak. This was a person. If the heroes were chasing him, then this was a villain. A villain attack. Holy shit. She was being attacked by a villain. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. I'm going to die. Panic overrode all rational thought, and she kicked and clawed until she broke the surface and gasped down air. Help, she began desperately. Help, she went to scream again, but was cut off by the liquid slipping back over her mouth. SHHHHH, the sewage monster hissed. Be quiet, little girl. A hero might hear you. That's what I want. I need a hero. Look, I just need your body for a little while. I just need to escape this city. He said with that revolting voice that shifted all of the liquid she was suspended in. She kicked violently at the villain's body in vain. Her eyes stared blearily through the sludge at the mouth of the tunnel. A hero will show up any moment now. They had to. That's what heroes did. They always showed up in the nick of time. They would save her. They had to. But there was no hero there. Chisaki kicked again and felt her lungs scream. She was out of air. Air, I can't breathe. Let me breathe. Please. A figure appeared at the mouth of the tunnel. Someone had come. A hero. All Might. All Might's come to save me. But then her vision shifted. That was not one man but two. Her eyes were no longer focusing properly. She kicked out again, thrashing desperately. Please save me, whoever you are. Then her vision went black. When she regained some semblance of consciousness, a few seconds she must have been on the floor, because her view was coming from very far below. She was looking up at a man with strange hands clutched all over his body, and at another man in a suit, who seemed to be made of black smoke. These two were not the heroes she had called for. Yeah, she decided, I'm hallucinating. Then she blacked out. When Chisaki Midoriya opened her eyes, she was met by an unfamiliar ceiling and a rush of shock. This wasn't her ceiling back home. Where was she? What was she doing here? She'd almost died. Two sketchy men, had saved her. Fuck. This wasn't the cement tunnel, and it wasn't a hospital. They had taken her somewhere, and she wasn't safe. She shut her eyes and tried to keep her breathing steady. They were probably nearby, keeping an eye on her. If they knew she was awake, then who was to tell what they'd do? No. It was best to play dead and pick up what she could. She needed every advantage she could get. If there was anything her life at the bottom of the food chain had taught her, it was to always play the field and hold every bit of leverage to her chest. The first thing she noticed as she lay, there was the intense stench of cigarette smoke that ran thick in her throat with every inhale. The second were the voices, just close enough that she could discern the conversation, but not so close as to be directly on top of her. There was a scraping sound of wood on something, probably a chair being pulled out. Why did you bring her here? It was a hissed whisper of disbelief. I thought we agreed to bring her to her house. Well, I didn't want to go searching through her things for an address. That would have been impolite. This second voice was calmer, but still notably hushed. God. We already saved her. There was a shuffling sound, and the voice became a peeved whine. We don't save people, Kurogiri. We're villains. That's just not what we do. Villains. Her mind recoiled at that thought. She would have flinched if she hadn't been working so hard to keep her body still. These people who saved her were villains. Not heroes. Villains. Why would a villain save me? Wasn't I attacked by a villain before? Do villains kill other villains? Are they going to kill me? Just where am I? She needed to open her eyes to better understand the situation. But if she did, they'd know she was awake. This was her only protection at the moment. She couldn't give that up yet. There was a pause, and then a sigh. Well, we've done it, Tamura, and it's our responsibility to help her. Responsibility, my ass, the first voice said in raspy retort. Leave that bullshit to the heroes. There was a rustle of material and a clink of glass. Tamura, keep your head on straight. Need I remind you that you're the one who suggested we kill that slime man? There was a new shift of material and the creak of a chair. He was overstepping his bounds as a mere pickpocket and thief, and he was drawing too much attention in our direction. That thing was just a loose end that needed cutting. And this mess with the girl is just a stupid, complicated byproduct. Will the two of you be quiet? This was a third voice that came from her left, and it was much closer than the other two. In fact, it was so close that Chisaki would have guessed that it was only an arm's length away. You're going to wake the damn girl up. Should she respond? Say, don't worry, I'm already awake. I heard everything you just said. No, these were villains, and she didn't want to play a smartass with people who were dangerous enough to kill people. Especially not when she was in their home turf. Instead, she should act like she'd just woken up from all the noise. Yet that sounded like a good idea. She shifted her weight a bit and grumbled, making a very conscious effort to move slowly. She didn't want to spook these people, but she also wanted to get an idea of her situation. She propped herself into a sitting position and clutched her head, letting her eyes scan her surroundings. She was sitting on the red leather seat of a booth. In front of her was a table, and in the booth on the other side of it was a man. He wore a worn-out brown suit and little round-tinted glasses that only partially obscured the shifty eye that peered over them. His appearance was poorly kept, with greasy gray hair, weak old stubble, and shaggy clothes. The cigar in his hand twinkled weakly in the dim bar as he raised it to his lips and took a drag. And, would you look at that? I was right. He grinned and let out a lungful of smoke. Chisaki made the mistake of inhaling. Where, the smoke clung to the back of her throat and sent her coughing. The words that she meant to sound strong and self-assured fell from her lips, crippled by her heaving into little more than a croak. Where am I? She gave another racking cough and glanced around as the smoke cleared. The room beyond their booth was lit by weak lamps that hung from the ceiling and spilt just enough dim light to see that across a few feet of checkered tile there stood a bar. A figure stood behind it, polishing a glass in his shadowy hands. Upon sight, he struck Chisaki as someone intensely familiar. This man, or she assumed he was a man since she couldn't properly tell, was dressed in a well-tailored and neat suit. What parts of him were visible seemed to be made of black-colored smoke. Oddly enough, his smoke body seemed to have no trouble handling physical objects, like the glass that he passed deftly between his hands, and the presence of two expressive pinpricks of light that watched her curiously from where his eyes should have been, suggested that this well-dressed man had a physical body of some sort. She had gotten little more than a glance at him before she'd passed out earlier, but he had certainly been there to save her from the sludge monster. Another man was there, slumped over at the bar with his back to her. Unlike the smoke man behind the bar, he did not show any interest at the disheveled man's announcement. Instead, he hunched further away from her, ignoring her stubbornly and cementing himself as an utter mystery. All she could infer was, based on the severed hands that gripped his arms and shoulders, that he was the other man she had seen in the tunnel. Somehow these two had saved her. This whole situation could not be real. Villains. Villains had saved her. These villains had saved her. Chisaki whipped back around to the disheveled man sitting across from her. Who are you? Where am I? The man cocked his head, his small eyes still watching her with an unnerving curiosity as he took an infuriatingly slow drag from his cigar. Hey, Shigaraki, are you good with us giving names? He called out loudly towards the bar with little more than a tilt of his head. Chisaki gave a little involuntary jump at the rise in tone, half expecting it to be hostility towards her before she processed the words and turned stiffly to eye the bar again. Which one of them was Shigaraki? The man slumped on the stool gave a grunt before he snarled. Do whatever you want. The man across from her gave a small grin to reveal his crooked, yellowed teeth and leaned forwards. Well, my name is Jurin. It's a pleasure to make your acquaintance, kid. He smelled sweet and bitter, like alcohol and tobacco. Was that what was stained on his shirt? Chisaki pressed her lips and tried not to breathe. What's your name? She swallowed hard and sat straight and tense. This was weird. Beyond weird. There was no way that she was handing out her name to these villains, even if they had saved her. But the man was watching her expectantly. He could be dangerous, and who knew what he could do if she didn't give an answer. Well, a first name was fine, right? Chisaki was a common enough name. They couldn't track her down with that, right? My name is Chisaki, she said slowly, still trying not to breathe too deeply. Well, it's nice to meet you, Chisaki. He grinned, tapping his cigarette against his forefinger. Suddenly, a gloved hand swooped in and snatched the cigarette from the man's hand. Jurin, I'm sure that I've told you not to smoke in here. It's a fire hazard, and it makes this place smell like a dump. The man made of smoke appeared at the edge of the table to exclaim disapprovingly as he crushed the butt of the cigarette into an ashtray that he held in his hand. Then he seemed to notice Chisaki and cleared his throat in embarrassment, quickly arranging his face into something she thought might have been a polite smile, but she couldn't quite tell. Forgive me for presenting something so unsightly. Allow me to start over. He put the ashtray onto the table and set next to it a coaster, and placed atop it a sparkling glass of water. Hello, young lady. It's nice to meet you. I'm Kurogiri. Forgive me for overhearing, but I believe that your name was Chisaki, was it not? She nodded tentatively, astonished by the light-hearted admonishment and confused by the sudden polite attitude. That's a wonderful name, the smoke man said kindly, before he motioned to the glass of water. I thought that you might be rather parched after your ordeal. If you'd prefer something more to drink, I can get it for you. Chisaki swallowed hard, suddenly conscious of how much her throat felt like sandpaper. The glass did look appealing. She could not deny that. But before she could reach for it, it occurred to her once again what kind of people she was dealing with. These men were all villains. They could have easily put something in her drink. This Kurogiri man must have noticed her hesitation. Please, don't worry about the drink. I promise you that it is just normal tap water. His eyes turned upwards in the corners reassuringly. Now she was certain that that was a smile. A smile for her. He was being kind. Thoughtful even. She wasn't sure how to take that. She could count on one hand how many people had been thoughtful to her. She should have been skeptical, especially given the circumstances. But Chisaki couldn't help but feel a small burst of joy in her chest. She took the glass and brought it to her lips for a tentative sip, still rolling the water over her tongue skeptically, only to find that it tasted completely normal. Perhaps it was just tap water after all. She smiled into the glass, relieved. Chisaki eyed the Kurogiri man as she drank, once again struck by that intense familiarity. As if she had seen him somewhere. Maybe on the street? Did villains just walk on the street with civilians? She had a hard time imagining that. He was probably wanted, wasn't he? Plus, she was sure that she would have remembered seeing someone with such an interesting-looking quirk, if that even was what gave him his smoke form. So, what was it? Where had she seen him? This continued to poke at her mind as the conversation shifted. Shigaraki, Jurin called over to the bar. Are you ever going to come and introduce yourself? The man on the stool shifted in blatant discomfort. Kurogiri, I think I'll just go upstairs, he said in a raspy voice. Kurogiri turned to chide him disapprovingly. Tamura, at least greet the young woman you saved. What's she going to think after we dragged her all the way back here? Her heart skipped a beat at his words. That guy, the one who can't even bear to look at her, was he really the one who had saved her? This villain with creepy hands all over his body. She would have laughed if she were anywhere else. Instead, her mouth hangs slightly ajar, and she had to remember to breathe. Well, she can think what she wants. And for the record, I didn't make you drag her back here. That was your decision. Shigaraki slid down from his stool, a glass in his hand. He shot her one look of utter disgust from behind the hand that clung to his face, before he turned and trudged towards a hall beside the bar. I'll be upstairs. And he disappeared out of view. Kurogiri sighed and turned around to face his guest. I apologize on his behalf. He's not really a bad person, he just has a lot of pressure on his shoulders, and he doesn't do too well with people he doesn't know. Chisaki gave a small smile, unsure of how to respond. In fact, she was completely at a loss. What was with these villains? They certainly weren't acting like any villains that she'd ever seen. They had been too considerate, too kind. Even that Shigaraki guy had been kind enough to take her here. But she had been unconscious. He hadn't asked to deal with her asking questions. That was, evidently, too far beyond his comfort zone. A step beyond saving lives. Kurogiri, the smoke man, was looking rather put out, and he sighed after the young man forlornly. Chisaki cleared her throat gingerly, hoping to reassure him. I don't mind too much. I can see why he would be nervous. Kurogiri blinked down at her for a moment, stunned. before he smiled again. "You're very kind, aren't you?" She froze, caught off guard, and then fought back a smile. When had she last heard a compliment? Thank you, but not particularly." "I hate to interrupt," Jurin said, looking bored, "but it's getting quite late." Kurogiri held up his wrist and checked his watch. "Oh yes, you're right." He looked up at Chisaki. "We should get you home, young woman." She watched him, bewildered, for a moment. "Just tell me where to drop you off." Kurogiri supplied helpfully. Sakura Park," she said, startled. It was in a residential area not too far from her house, so she could travel from there easily. But it was just far enough from home to be indicative of her address. Were they going to let her go just like that? These guys were villains, right? This was too easy. They were too nice. "We can do that," Kurogiri said with his eyes doing their smiling thing. He then turned away to face the empty part of the room. He held his hand out and, to Chisaki's amazement, a vortex of black smoke began to form and grow in the air. Within seconds, it had grown large enough to fit Chisaki herself. "Wow," a bright smile of amazement plastering itself across her face. Was this a transportation quirk? How did it work? Were passengers supposed to just walk through and show up at their destination? How did someone even determine the destination? Did it ever fail? Were there any limits? Did it drain a lot of energy? Kurogiri cleared his throat, obviously trying to get her attention. Chisaki blinked at him. He looked to the disheveled man, and they shared a nervous look. "Are you all right?" the smoke man asked, looking her over with concern. "Are you sure that you didn't see her hit her head or anything?" Jurin said, eyeing her skeptically. I'm sorry." "What?" Chisaki looked between them in confusion. "The mumbling. You were mumbling about my quirk," Kurogiri said slowly. Her eyes widened in realization, and she clamped her hands over her mouth in embarrassment. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I said all of that out loud, didn't I?" Kurogiri gave a little nod. A hole opened up in her stomach. If only the floor would swallow her. "Oh, I'm so sorry. I do that sometimes when I get excited. It's probably really creepy. I've been told that it's off-putting." Jurin let out a barking laugh. "Ha, kiddo. If that's your only flaw, then you're better off than most of us." Her face turned beet red. She was about to protest more when the phone rang, startling everyone. Kurogiri and Jurin shared a look Chisaki couldn't paste. Kurogiri let his vortex dissipate, and he went to grab the phone. He held the receiver up to his face, in something Chisaki read as a forced calm. "Yes, sensei?" he asked slowly. For a second, he was quiet. Then he nodded and spoke into the mouthpiece. "Yes, sir. I will do that immediately." He put the phone back on its hook and turned towards Chisaki. She could see that he was trying to smile, but not quite succeeding. "There's someone who wants to meet you." Kurogiri materialized a new vortex. What had happened? Who was on the phone? Kurogiri had called them sensei. Her heart thudded in her chest as a realization struck her. Could that have been the sensei that she remembered? No, it couldn't be. Sensei was a common label for teachers. It must have been someone else. And yet she couldn't deny the flicker of hope and excitement in her chest at the possibility of it really being him. Then she saw the expressions on the villains' faces. Jurin and Kurogiri were both looking at her with a mix of pity and apprehension. Was something wrong? "Just go through there. I'll be right behind you." Kurogiri was motioning stiffly towards the portal. Chisaki paused and studied the vortex. Everything gave the indication that she might very well be walking to her death. And yet her curiosity edged her on. The possibility of seeing her one supporter again. The only person who had ever told her that she could be a hero despite the odds. That's what drove her feet forward. She was half through the portal when Kurogiri asked her something strange. "You wouldn't happen to be quirkless, would you?" His tone was even in a way that she had not heard it all night. It made her skin crawl. Chisaki gave a slow nod, a cannonball of dread settling into her stomach. I see. He paused, frowning. Well, you best be going. I do not suggest keeping our boss waiting. She swallowed hard and edged her feet through the dark portal. For a second, everything was black, and then she emerged into a large room. Across one wall were a series of screens, each displaying different places. One, she noticed, displayed a view of the bar, while another showed a row of tubes, inside of which floated big, purple, muscular, bird-faced, humanoid things. Ahem, a voice came from her right. Chisaki spun around. Now, with her back to the screens, she properly surveyed the rest of the room and saw the hulking curiosity that filled the rest of that space. Against the far wall, facing the screens, was a large throne-like seat, behind which rumbled a mass of machinery. Sitting in that seat, looking at her expectantly, was a man. His face was so heavily scarred that he had no eyes that she could see, nor any hair. Protruding from his throat came a long dark pipe, and small eaves jutted out from his arms and the sides of his neck. Her eyes followed the tubes and wires back to the amalgamation of machinery. For a moment, she could only stare at the array, shocked, almost terrified. She wasn't sure how she should react. She thought for a moment about how this man looked, and how she had gotten so excited to see that sensei man again. Her heart fell. So, she was not here to meet her sensei after all. The man she had met all those years ago certainly hadn't looked like this. The man before her cleared his throat. Chisaki jumped, startled, her face turning red in embarrassment. He must have caught her staring. She began, awkwardly. It's nice to see you again, Chisaki Midoriya. The man said with a warm smile. Her heart stopped in her chest, and her eyes flew wide with shock and wonder. No, it can't be. It's been 6 years, if I remember correctly. It is you. But you didn't look like this. She sputtered in confusion. He gave a small laugh. Yes, I can understand your confusion. At the time I had to use a quirk to hide my face. As I'm sure that you can imagine, my appearance is not very, palatable. Unfortunately, if I were to be seen like this on the street, I would be locked away faster than you can blink. Oh, I see, Chisaki said, nodding numbly, still trying to reconcile her hopes and memories with reality. Her eyes fell on the colossal tangle of machinery around him. What about all of this? Where'd this come from? Sensei gave a little laugh. A bit of a spectacle, I know. I wish that I didn't need it. Unfortunately, all of this is vital to keeping me alive and healthy. Chisaki's brows knit in worry, and she leaned in as if the proximity would reveal some evidence to his situation. Are you okay? Do you have some kind of condition? He gave a small chuckle. Not quite. Sensei seemed to watch her for a second, although she couldn't quite tell since his eyes were obscured by those nasty scars. Would you like to take a seat? You've been standing for quite a while. He motioned her towards the center of the room, to the empty air. Sure, Chisaki said, startled. She hadn't realized how long she had been standing for. She looked around for a chair or somewhere to sit. To her amazement, the man before her snapped his fingers, and the ground to which he'd pointed began to spark with strange lightning. Suddenly, a rectangle of ground rose up to about her waist, and a slate of stone shot off from the ground, and rose higher than the first piece to form the back of a chair. The lightning stopped, and Chisaki had to take a moment to make sure that the ground wasn't going to shift again. How does it look? Sensei asked kindly. Chisaki circled around from the back and sat down gingerly. It looks good. Who knew that the ground could be so comfortable if it were just reshaped? She said with a polite laugh. I am glad to hear that. He nodded and paused thoughtfully. So, what was I saying before? Oh yes, I don't really have a condition in the sense of an illness. You see, I am simply very, very old, and a couple years ago, I was seriously hurt. It just seems that my age is catching up with me, and a true recovery has become, well, impossible. Is there anything that I can do? Chisaki asked in concern. Sensei threw his head back and gave a deep, throaty laugh. Oh, God, no. I've already done everything there is to do to try and extend my life. Besides, I don't have anything else I want to do here. He paused for a moment. Well, except for that. But that's not really my job anymore. I will be leaving my dream to my protege after all. I have finally relinquished my claim to this world. He sighed. I've come such a long way too. This world has come such a long way, albeit not entirely in the right direction. What do you mean? Chisaki asked, curious. Sensei tilted his head at her thoughtfully. I don't want to impose my ideals on you. They're not the most socially accepted. She smiled a small smile. I mean no offense, Sensei. But I'm quirkless. My existence itself isn't socially accepted. Sensei let loose a barking laugh. Well, I suppose that a history lesson wouldn't be too nefarious. He paused for a moment while Chisaki got comfortable in her chair. She had a feeling that this was going to be a long story. I was born in a time when the majority of people were still quirkless. It's kind of ironic to think that the majority is now the minority. Back then, there was widespread unrest. Society couldn't adapt fast enough to accommodate the new development of the supernatural. At first, everything was great. People were ecstatic to think that the comic book stories had come true. Things that only existed in fiction were now possible with Quirks. We got heroes and legends. But, inevitably, we got the other side of that coin. Villains and people with their own agendas rose as well. The world became exponentially more dangerous. Villain groups began to form, each seeking their own stability and gain amongst the turmoil. As time passed, more people gained quirks and society adapted to account for the masses. A new system arose to protect the civilian people, the hero system. But the problem was that the good and the bad got thrown in together. Heroes aren't pure and infallible. They're just as human as villains. Chisaki cocked her head. You said that you were born at the beginning of this. She began slowly. The way that you talk about it, I can't imagine that you just stood by. What was your part in this revolution of social order? She watched him curiously. Sensei's thoughtful frown dissolved into a sly, nostalgic smile. Well, I created one of those independent villain groups. I was looking to create a new order. I didn't agree with these heroes and simply moved to assert myself as a new power in that tumultuous world. I maintained my influence in the underground for a while, until I was recognized as a villain and targeted by those newborn heroes. My own brother opposed me, even until his death. That last bit pains me even now. It's a heavy regret of mine, not seeing him off while on good terms. Even to this day, my brother's successors are after my head. Even the Hero Association has me classified as a high-level threat. He concluded with a bitter laugh as he tugged at the wires that buried under his skin. It's funny how life twists like this, huh? Are you still a villain? Chisaki pressed her lips nervously. How could he admit something so earth-shattering so easily? I suppose so, though I've been hiding for the last 10 years or so. So maybe I'm retired or something like that. He said with a dismissive laugh, doing that thing where he looked like he was looking at her. I need to process this for a moment, she said, turning away from him. So, Sensei is a villain. Sensei is a villain. Sensei is a villain. No, stay calm. She can't freak out. Not in front of him. She took a deep breath. The only person to ever support my effort of becoming a hero is a villain. A big villain too. This was just too bizarre. Should she be hurt? Angry? Betrayed? How did people react to something like this? What kind of a reaction was he looking for? He mentioned a protege and a dream. Who was this protege? What dream? What was his goal? Why did he want to talk to her in the first place? Did he still believe that she could be a hero? Did he ever believe that at all? He obviously thought that heroes and villains weren't very different. Is that why he said that to her that day 6 years ago? Chisaki took a deep breath and set her shoulders, deciding on a single question. She turned around to face the man who had just shaken her world. With all due respect, Sensei, why did you bring me here? He chuckled in amusement and leaned back in his chair, folding his hands in front of him, as if he expected the question and found her response predictably entertaining. Well, I wanted to see how you were doing, Chisaki. You could have seen how I was doing just fine from those screens, she said coldly, motioning over her shoulder, her eyes narrowed. Why bring me here? Are you still hoping to be a hero? He asked, his tone equally as cold, ignoring her previous question. Chisaki flinched, taken aback by the change in his tone and his dismission of her question. Yes, she responded icily. And how's that going for you? He asked with a small grin, as if he already knew the answer. She sat up straight, but spoke as if her dangerous conversation partner were nothing more than the most suspicious stranger. Just fine, thank you. I'm going to apply to UA. Oh, UA? Don't you think that you're setting your sights a bit high? Do you think they'll admit you? A quirk-less little girl. She flinched, but quickly recovered and stood tall. She couldn't show him how much that hurt. But he had hit too close to home. How had he hit her insecurities so precisely? Why? Her eyes slid aside guiltily. No, honestly, I don't think they will. My chances of being accepted are slim. But I have to try. If I don't even try, I'll never have any hope of succeeding. That's an admirable mindset, but unfortunately the world does not run on positivity. What would you do if you were given the opportunity to gain a quirk? He asked, his voice still cold and matter-of-fact, devoid of that earlier cheer. Chisaki's mind sputtered. Gain a quirk? That hadn't even occurred to her as an option. Was that even possible? How would that happen? She asked dubiously. Well, for now, let's just play a game of what-ifs. We can think about how later. He said with a grin. Well, she began in a slow and cautious drone. I would apply to UA and hope I get accepted. If I did get accepted, I would follow that path until I graduate. Then I'd become a real hero and, well, save people. He tilted his head to the side. Save people from villains. She didn't respond. And how do you feel about us villains? I'm sure that you must have some opinion. I don't like you. You're unpredictable and dangerous. Dangerous because we're unpredictable? He asked quizzically. Aren't you sure that that sounds like something everyone out there would want you to be thinking? Not something you've seen for yourself? Because we're deviants. Because our only way to survive is to work outside the system. No, Chisaki exclaimed, before remembering herself and reeling herself in. I can't read you, predict you. We're human, aren't we? I can read human beings like open books. You, for example, you're a smart girl, good-natured and quick-witted. You're naturally curious and know when to follow and when to lead. You hate it when people talk down to you, but you can recognize when to take shit. Your whole life you've lived at the bottom of the food chain. Nobody wants to help you and everybody loves to step on you. The few people who genuinely care about you are too caught up in their own messes to see you hurting. You've suffered betrayals and deceits, so you're overly cautious and analytical. As a result, you can hold up a mask and smile along with anything short of bloodshed. He gave her that look without eyes to look with. How was that? Spot on, she said begrudgingly, quickly shaking her head. But the biggest difference between heroes and villains is what they fight for. Heroes don't fight for themselves, but for the people. People like me, who can't fight for themselves. Sensei leaned forward. I have something to tell you, Chisaki. Heroes don't fight for others. They're only interested in their own gain, just like villains. No. There are heroes, like All Might, who are ready to sacrifice themselves for the people. They're completely selfless. She shot back defensively. People like All Might are keeping secrets while smiling for the camera. They have a public image to protect. Exactly. It's all about their public image. Meanwhile, people like you and me are being trampled underfoot. Chisaki's eyes went wide in shock, feeling like someone had just slapped her. He just lumped the two of them together. He was acting as if she had been oppressed by society. But hadn't she? Hasn't she been stepped on by everyone at school? Kachon and his friends might be the only ones directly going after her. But everyone else was laughing and standing by while she got hurt. All because she didn't have a quirk and didn't fit into their archetypes. Someone cleared their throat behind her. "What is it, Kurogiri?" Sensei asked curtly. "Sir, it's almost 7. It may not be my place to say this, but Chisaki's parents are going to begin to wonder where she is. We should get her home before they alert the authorities." Sensei sighed. "You have a point." He paused for a moment to assess Chisaki's reaction. She was still looking numbly at the hands folded in her lap. "Chisaki, why don't we leave our discussion here for today? We can resume our debate another day." She looked up and nodded, still dazed. Kurogiri began to prepare a warp gate. As her exit formed and her departure became a concrete reality, she was struck by a thought and found her voice. "How will I contact you?" Sensei smiled, amused, before he reached next to his seat and grabbed a pad of paper, scribbled something on it, and then ripped the page out. "You can call for Kurogiri at this number." He extended the page to Chisaki with a kind smile. She stood and took it deftly. "Thank you, Sensei. The portal is ready," Kurogiri announced. Chisaki stood to leave, reaching down to pick up her backpack. She felt really awkward, leaving just like this. Only seconds ago, she had been arguing with this imposing man. She took a few stiff steps towards the portal. "I hope to hear from you soon," Sensei said from behind her. She turned and let loose a small smile. "I will do my best, Sensei." With that, she was ushered through Kurogiri's portal, gone. When she had left, Kurogiri watched his master cautiously. "What are you planning to do with her, sir?" "Do with her? Nothing. What she does is up to her. I simply find her entertaining, such a curious, despairing mind." For a moment there was a long pause. "Kurogiri, how do you think she would fare as a villain?" Chisaki stepped out from the portal, setting foot in a familiar park. So, she had been taken to Sakura Park, just as promised. God, what had just happened? Did she really just spend the whole afternoon talking to villains? No, even before that, she'd gotten attacked and rescued by villains. After that one thought, panic struck her. Wait a minute. What time had Kurogiri said it was? She fished her phone out of her backpack in trepidation. She turned it on, thank God. It was okay, its display read 7:22. Shit, she exclaimed. It was way past dinner time. What was she going to tell her mom? Chisaki climbed the steps to the second story of her apartment building, trepidation knotting her guts with worry. Oh God, her mom was so going to kill her. She approached the door to their apartment with caution, hoping to whoever was listening that it was locked, that her mom was out working the late shift at the hospital. They must have not been listening, because the door turned easily under her grip, and the door sprung open. Chisaki's heart plummeted. There, standing in the entryway, was her mother, Inko, a look of thorough disapproval and anger twisting her warm features. Her hands shook in anger as she clutched a phone in her hand. Where have you been, Chisaki? She exclaimed, furious, as she marched up to her daughter. Do you have any idea how long I've been waiting for you? I've been worried sick. Chisaki curled in on herself, sheepish and apologetic. I'm so sorry, Mom. I fell asleep at the park. She fidgeted with the hem of her shirt nervously, deciding that flimsy lie would have to work, and went all in. I decided to stop at the park on my way home, and I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, the sun was already setting, and I ran here as soon as possible. Inko narrowed her eyes, dubious. Then what is that burn mark on your shoulder? Chisaki glanced at the offending burn mark in surprise. What burn mark? It was a relatively large, brown handprint-shaped singe on her white blouse. It must have been from Kachon's antics at school. How had she almost forgotten about that? It seemed like a lifetime ago. Oh, it's nothing, Mom. Chisaki began with a dismissive wave as she moved past Inko and into the living room. It's just from some play fighting at school. You know how Kachon gets, always playing his practical jokes. She chuckled nervously and avoided her mom's eyes. Her mom couldn't know about how Kachon treated her. She'd been lying for so long now that it was second nature. Inko sighed and released her death grip on her phone, setting it down on the living room table. Fine, I'll let this one slide. I'm just glad that you're okay, she said, relaxing visibly. She gazed at her daughter for a moment with sad eyes. What's wrong, Mom? Chisaki asked, concerned at the change. Nothing, honey, she said evenly, her voice hollow. She shook her head after a moment, and she looked up to meet her daughter's eyes with a smile. What do you want for dinner? She asked, suddenly rather chipper, as she moved towards the kitchen. I could make lasagna, or spaghetti, or chicken noodle soup. I know that it's been getting rather cold lately, and with the way you were sleeping outside, I wouldn't want you to get sick. Chisaki took her mother's sudden change in stride, mentally filing it into her box of worries for later inspection. I think that chicken soup sounds good, she responded with a smile. Do you want a hand making it? I've always wanted to learn how you make the best soup in the world. Her mother gave a hearty laugh. Of course, honey, she exclaimed happily. The more the merrier. An hour later, the pair sat down at the dinner table, bowls of warm soup steaming alluringly. This looks so good, Chisaki exclaimed. Well, it is the family recipe, Inko said with a bright smile as she brought a spoonful to her lips. Chisaki took a mouthful of her own, ravenous. After a moment, her eyes went wide with delight. Oh my God, I think it's even better than the usual. Her mother's smile widened. It must be all the love you put into it. You mean, all the love that you put into it? Chisaki said back. Her mother laughed, and the two lapsed into a comfortable silence as they savored their soup. After a moment, Chisaki noticed that her mother had stopped eating. Inko's gaze had become unfocused for a moment as she stared at the wooden table listlessly. What's wrong, Mom? Chisaki asked, setting down her spoon in concern. Her mother looked up slowly, as if preparing herself to deliver grave news. Honey, I got a promotion today, she said slowly, as if testing the words on her lips. That sounds great. I'm so happy for you, Chisaki exclaimed energetically, but seeing her mother's solemn demeanor, she grew hesitant. That is a good thing, isn't it? Inko sighed. I'm going to be working even more late nights at the hospital, so I'll be out until 9, Monday through Thursday. She gave another sigh and began to finger her skirt nervously. Earlier, I was talking to Mitsuki, Katsuki's mother. She said that the Bakugos would be happy to have you over for dinner on Mondays and Wednesdays. For the first week or two, I'll be able to make you meals ahead of time and leave them for you in the fridge. But beyond that, you'll have to fix yourself something. She paused for a moment. Her gaze had gradually dropped back to the table, and she covered her face with her hands. I feel like such a failure as a mother. Chisaki's heart was in her throat. Don't say that, she exclaimed. You're wonderful, Mom. You care so much about me, and you're always working yourself to the bone. You can't beat yourself up about this. Inko looked up from her hands, and Chisaki saw that there were tears in her eyes. You don't hate me. Chisaki's heart squeezed. She stood and moved around the table to wrap her arms around her mother. How could I hate you? Chisaki whispered. You're the best mom anyone could ask for. Inko gave a sob and buried her face into her daughter's shoulder. You really mean that? Of course, Mom. The woman began to cry, big tears of exhaustion and guilt soaking into her daughter's shirt. An hour later, when Inko had gone to bed, Chisaki stood alone in the kitchen, washing the dishes. She wasn't entirely sure how to feel about her mother's breakdown. On one hand, it was nice that she wasn't keeping her concerns bottled up. After all, she preferred this much more than her mother suffering in secret. On the other hand, Chisaki wasn't sure what to do with the information. Everything seemed to be crashing down today, with the UA applications, this whole villain thing with Sensei, and now her mother's anxiety. Wait, hadn't Sensei given her a phone number to call? Where'd she put that paper? Don't tell me I've lost it, she thought. The bowl she'd been washing fell forgotten into the sink, and she hurried to dry her hands on her pants before running her hands through her pockets. It took a whole gut-wrenching minute of searching, but she found the page folded neatly in her back pocket. She drew it out and unfolded it. Scrolled across the page in a slanted script was a string of numbers. Chisaki flipped out her phone and quickly created a new contact, registering the phone number under the name Bartender Boy. Sensei had said that this was a way to contact Kurogiri, and since Kurogiri was dressed as a bartender, she couldn't help but smile. It would be her little inside joke with herself. Almost as soon as she'd created the thing, she felt rather lame. Her inner critic cringed. No normal person would find a joke with themselves funny. But who cared? She was the only person seeing the dumb contact. She was going to enjoy her dumb joke, whether it was cringy or not. That night passed fitfully for Chisaki. While she had gotten to bed at the remarkably reasonable time of 9:30 p.m., weird dreams plagued her. She was a toddler in one, playing with green slime, or in another she was looking in the mirror and watching as her face warped, scarred beyond recognition. By the time she rolled out of bed at a little past 7 a.m., she felt poorly rested and drained. On any normal day, Chisaki would have just gone back to sleep. But after her brain's pesky insistence on revisiting yesterday's troubles, her bed had come to feel like a prison, and her stomach was knotting with nerves and indecision. So she forced herself up and sat down at her computer. Immediately, she went to her open tabs, habit gripping her in search of the safe familiarity of the hero news sites. Come on, she muttered to herself. Let there be something on here. Come on, I need something. Like an addict, she knew only one way to put her head back on straight. She needed the comfort of the hero fights, of their victory. Then she found it. One of the sites had been pinged at 6:30. Kamui Woods had been seen confronting a pair of violent bank robbers by the train station, and the situation had shown no signs of de-escalating. Perfect, Chisaki exclaimed, practically shooting out of her chair in excitement. She rushed to change out of her PJs, grabbed her trusty notebook for the future, Hero Analysis #13, and sprinted out of her bedroom. Bye, Mom, I'll be right back, she exclaimed as she charged through the living room. I'm just going down to the train station to check something out. She had to pause at the entryway to pull her shoes on. Is it another one of those hero fights? You know how I feel about you going to those, Inko said disapprovingly from the couch. Chisaki rolled her eyes and bounced excitedly, reaching for the door. Don't worry, Mom, I'll be sure to be extra careful, she called over her shoulder as she turned the handle. And with that, she shot out the door before her mother could protest further. Chisaki sprinted the whole way to the train station, pushing her lungs and her legs to their limits. Come on, she thought desperately as she ran. I just need a few seconds. Even if the fight is already ending, I just need to see some heroes in action. When a throng appeared in view, Chisaki gave a gasp of delight. She dragged her feet to an inelegant, fumbling stop and took the opportunity to finally catch her breath and admire the situation. Admire was a strong word. Wonder turned to dread when she saw the damages. Several buildings were on fire and 2 ambulances were parked only a few feet away, each surrounded by groups of frantic paramedics. A man on a stretcher lay to her left. Chisaki's stomach gave a nauseating flip when she saw that the man was bleeding from his head and his left arm was bent at an unnatural angle. A pair of paramedics quickly lifted him away. The situation was obviously much more dire than the alert had suggested. Chisaki tried to get a glance at the battle, hoping that maybe the situation was improving somewhat. But the group of people were pressed so close together that she couldn't get close. When some firefighters led by water hero Backdraft, no less showed up and needed to get by. The mob parted to let them pass and Chisaki got a brief glance at the situation. Kamui Woods seemed injured. One of his arms hung limp at his side, and he was shooting branches at 2 men who had taken refuge behind a capsized car. One of the 2 men either had a fire-producing quirk or a weapon to produce flames, because fire shot out at the hero. Kamui moved back in an attempt to dodge. Then the crowd began to close up again. Chisaki cursed under her breath and ran forwards, aiming to get into the center of the throng before the gap closed completely. She must have made it just in time, because she ran into someone and bodies were suddenly jostling her restlessly, pressing in on her. The whole situation was rather claustrophobic. Now she could see even less of the fight, just the shirt of the guy in front of her and the arm of the dude next to her. I need to push my way through, Chisaki thought decidedly. She began to shove her way through the gap between the people in front of her. Excuse me, or sorry about this. She murmured an apology as she squeezed her way through the crowd. Chisaki gave one final shove and she was through. She took a deep breath of unoppressive air and observed the ongoing battle with mounting excitement. Before her, the fight raged in favor of the villains. One of the villains, he looked to have a shark face for a head and held a gun that spewed flames, was still targeting the wounded Kamui Woods. At first, the other villain was nowhere to be seen. Backdraft seemed to be attempting to aid Kamui in his struggle against the flamethrower and its wielder, but had to shift his attention when the second robber reappeared and began to throw chunks of rubble at him and the crowd. Chisaki whipped out her notebook and began to scribble down notes as she observed the fight progress. The second robber's quirk must be something akin to super strength. The robber with the flamethrower has no discernible quirk, but seems to be winning purely because Kamui's wood is extremely weak to fire. If Backdraft and Kamui were to switch opponents, they would have a better chance of winning. This situation highlights one of Kamui's major flaws as a hero. He has no way of fighting an opponent with access to fire. Also, he seems to have a problem with over-reliance on his quirk. He isn't making any headway since his opponent just burns what he throws at them. If Kamui had some kind of gear or hand-to-hand combat skills to fight with, he would be doing much better. For now, it just looks like he plans to dodge and run until his opponent runs out of energy or incendiary solution. I'm just not sure if Kamui will be able to last that long. Backdraft appears to be attempting to distract his opponent with shoots of water, in order to keep the crowd safe. He also seems to be trying to hit the fires when possible. Hey, kid, cut that out. Can't you see that this situation is serious? A man growled down at her in reproach. She blinked in surprise at being interrupted in such a way. Oh, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't realize that I was bothering you. Bothering me? You're just downright creepy. You should be in a mental institution. Another voice came from behind her. Hey, another man said. Let the poor girl be. She's not hurting anyone. Besides, the heroes will figure things out, like they always do. The grumpy man looked like he was about to say something when a thundering voice cut him off. Hello, dear citizens, came the call as a man soared above them, his hulking figure temporarily silhouetted as he blocked the sun. This new hero landed in the street with a resounding crack, as the pavement shattered into a crater at the impact, and a cloud of dust enveloped the man. Chisaki gasped. That figure, that voice, that flashy arrival. It couldn't be. But it had to be. It was him. The dust began to clear in dramatic wisps, to reveal a blue and red, skin-tight suit and a muscular form, accentuated by those two unmistakable, vertical-pointing, blonde tufts of hair. Worry not, for I am here. And it was him. All Might, she said breathlessly. It was All Might in the flesh. The hero of heroes himself stood before her. The robbers and the heroes alike were frozen, the robbers in fear and the heroes in relief, while they caught their breath. Then Backdraft finally returned his attention towards the fires that raged along a pair of storefronts, and that threatened to consume some of the surrounding buildings. Now then, All Might said in that carrying voice. You two villains, I have a suggestion for you. Turn yourselves in to the authorities, and no one here needs to get hurt. The two villains shared a look, and Chisaki gave a guess on what they were thinking. Something like, if we're going down anyways, let's go down fighting. She must have been right, because one man sprayed fire with his flamethrower, while the other threw a car at the newly arrived hero. Both attempts at an attack were in vain, of course, but Chisaki had to give them props for their guts. All Might made sure to stay out of reach of the gun and its spitting fire, and caught the flying car before carefully setting it down. The villain with the super strength threw another chunk of concrete, this one with iron bars protruding from it. All Might caught the projectile and hurled it back at the man, who managed to dodge it by a hair's breadth. Come now, lads, do we really need to keep going like this? All Might asked sympathetically. I don't want to have to get serious here. The villain, of course, didn't answer. The great hero sighed. All right then. But don't say I didn't warn you. There was a flash of movement, and All Might seemed to disappear for a split second. Then he reappeared just behind the flamethrower-wielding villain. All Might pulled his arm back and let loose a terrifying punch at the villain's feet. There was a sound, like the clap of thunder, and a wind so strong that it knocked the villain clean off his feet. Chisaki thought that she had even caught a little breeze from her position on the sidelines. She expected the villain to get back up, but he stayed down, immobile and unconscious. With one of the villains incapacitated, All Might turned to the other. The poor man was shaking, as he stood only a few feet away, only now realizing the danger he had subjected himself to. You don't have to get hurt. You can still surrender. All Might said graciously. The man nodded. I surrender, he said shakily. The police must have shown up at some point, because a handful of officers ran forward and proceeded to handcuff the villain who was still conscious, and picked up his comatose partner. All Might turned to the crowd of onlookers, with his trademark smile shining brightly. Is everyone else all right? He asked with his booming voice. If any of you need medical attention, the paramedics are just over there. Please don't hesitate to see them. They'll take care of you. Reporters began to break through the crowd and began to run towards him. All Might, one of them called. And then another. All Might, and another. All Might, each clamoring for some exclusive insight from the number one hero. All Might smiled, but didn't seem to quite respond to them. Well, I apologize, but I have somewhere I need to be. I wish all of you a good day. With that, he darted away, narrowly avoiding the advancing wave of eager reporters and journalists. Chisaki watched him soar through the air and land with a stumble at the end of the block. Meanwhile, the reporters flocked to Backdraft, who had finished putting out the fires, and the crowd of onlookers began to disperse. Why is All Might in such a hurry? She thought in bewilderment. Then something occurred to her as she looked down at her notebook. Oh, she should follow him and see if she could get his autograph. This was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, after all, and she might never get this close to All Might in person again. Chisaki sprinted her way down the pavement and around firefighters, onlookers, and paramedics. Chisaki watched in slow motion as her hero turned the corner with a concerned glance over his shoulder. No. Wait, All Might, don't go. I need to get your autograph. She turned the corner. There he was, turning another corner. She noticed that he looked rather distressed. But surely it was nothing. This was All Might after all. He had nothing to be distressed over. But that was an odd place to be going. Chisaki knew that corner. That was a dead-end alleyway. All Might would have nowhere to go. That was perfect. She could corner him. I'm going to meet All Might. I'm going to meet All Might. I'm going to meet All Might. She was almost there now. She sped up. She turned the corner and almost shouted in alarm. She must have taken that corner too fast, because she lost her footing and went flying to the side. Chisaki only got a glimpse of the alleyway before she crashed into a pile of trash bags. That was real elegant, Chisaki. Now All Might's totally going to want to talk to you. Now that you've proven yourself to be a bumbling fool. And now you smell like trash. She gave a groan and rubbed her bruised tailbone. Are you okay? A raspy voice asked her. Chisaki looked up in surprise. The man who stood before her was almost skeletal, thin with unhealthily protruding cheekbones, with shaggy blonde hair that stuck out awkwardly around his head. He seemed to be clutching his abdomen below his baggy white shirt, as if in pain. His small blue eyes watched her with an honest concern and were focused on her expectantly. Oh, I'm fine. She sputtered nervously, her gaze moving behind the man as she scanned her surroundings for All Might's hulking figure. I'm glad to hear that, the man said with a smile. Thank you for your concern, Chisaki said absent-mindedly. But, by any chance, have you seen All Might? I'm sure that I saw him pass through here. The man's smile dropped an inch, and she could see some worry in his eye. All Might. No, I haven't seen him. I'm definitely not him, or related to him in any way, the man said with a nervous laugh. Okay, that was kind of suspicious and way out of left field. She hadn't asked about him being All Might, which led her to believe that. No, this guy can't be All Might. I mean, how? All Might was definitely, certainly, irrefutably the #1 hero with a silhouette that she would know anywhere. He was well built, healthy, strong enough to take on the strongest villains. And this guy looked like he could break in two if you so much as nudged him wrong. Sure, Chisaki said awkwardly as she ran her eyes over the alley again. Everything looked normal, just a bunch of trash and stray garbage. There was a suspicious splash of colorful fabric poking out between a bit of trash in the corner of the alleyway. What's that? She asked, getting up and stumbling towards that bit of fabric. It was blue, just like All Might's uniform. Oh, that's nothing. Totally not related to All Might, the strange man exclaimed, waving his hands in a panicked frenzy. Chisaki passed him, focused entirely on her new target of interest. She reached down and pulled that bit of material gingerly. Soon, she was holding a complete All Might suit. She turned to the man, perplexed. What the hell? She asked, looking between the weak little man and the suit All Might always wore. She ran her fingers over it. It wasn't a cheap reproduction. Please give that to me, young lady. The distress was evident in his eyes, but there was a polite forcefulness to his words. Chisaki's brain worked, connecting outlandish dot to outlandish dot. All Might had disappeared. This shady guy was the only one here. He'd acted strangely when she'd mentioned All Might. He had All Might's costume. This man even shared some hazy, physical characteristics with All Might. The blonde hair, blue eyes. Even that serious tone reminded her of All Might. Chisaki took a deep breath as dread settled in her stomach. She locked eyes with the strange man. Tell me something. And please, I need a straight answer. Are you All Might? The laughed nervously, wringing his hands and staring off. Me? All Might? No, there's no way. His lungs seized, and he doubled over in a fit of racking coughs. Flecks of something red splattered across his lips. Are you okay? Chisaki asked, alarmed. Was that blood? Should she call an ambulance? I cough. I'm fine. This is normal, he said shakily, as he wiped away the blood with the back of his hand. A silence fell between them. Chisaki watched the man wearily, worried that he might go back to coughing up blood. He, meanwhile, pressed his lips thoughtfully, eyes on the sky, before he took a deep breath. My name is Toshinori Yagi. The man began in a decidedly calm tone. I am All Might. Chisaki blinked. Her breath caught in her throat. She felt her knees go weak, and she fell back against the wall, the empty uniform clutched like a lifeline in her hands. All Might? You? I don't understand. But how? I just saw you stop those villains. You were fine. You were normal. I understand that this might be difficult for you. Toshinori began calmly. But you seem like a sensible young woman, and well, even I need to tell someone the truth every once in a while. Chisaki could only watch in horror as he lifted the corner of his baggy shirt to reveal a crater-like wound on his abdomen. This, he began, is a wound that I have had since 7 years ago. I fought a terrifying villain, and while I managed to subdue them, they still managed to get me pretty good. Even after multiple surgeries, my internal organs are still. Well, I've been told that they will never recover. When I was told this, I was also told to quit hero work altogether. But how could I when so many people needed me? So, here I am. Still showing up to fight while I can. I'm on a time limit these days. So I can only maintain the appearance that you call normal for a few hours a day. When that time is up, I return to looking like this. The number one hero, her hero, was just a weak, wounded man. Chisaki could only stare at him. Her biggest hero, the person who she had aspired to be, he wasn't not omnipotent. He was human, yeah. That was rational, right? I mean, it was unreasonable to expect him to never get injured or anything. But she wasn't expecting this. Very few people know about my condition. As I'm sure you can imagine, knowledge like this is quite dangerous. So, I would greatly appreciate it if you didn't share it with others. Toshinori said slowly, watching the girl across from him inquisitively. Chisaki nodded slowly, still trying to take in what this revelation really meant. How? She took a deep breath and steadied herself. Okay. How does no one know about this yet? That All Might, the number one hero, is so injured that he's coughing up blood. Toshinori gave her a small, sad smile. Well, I asked that my condition not be made public. I want people to feel safe. If the people know that their symbol of peace is just as mortal as them, they'll feel vulnerable and defenseless. I want to bring people a sense of security. Is that why you're still a hero, even though you're so hurt? Chisaki asked, meeting his eyes with a quiet boldness. Exactly, he said, his smile widening. As a hero, it is my duty to the people to smile and fearlessly defend them. Something that Sensei had said gnawed at her. He had mentioned something. Heroes are just smiling for the camera. Judging from Toshinori's account, that held water. All Might the hero was nothing more than a facade. Fuck. She couldn't help but feel betrayed. But this weak man in front of her, was he really to blame for lying? The people, the hero system, needed him to put on that facade just to preserve their lie of safety. It had made people like Catch-on Kings. It had pushed her under their heel. She had simply drawn the short end of the stick. The realization twisted in her chest. It pounded in her ears. It repeated in her brain like shards of glass. She needed to talk about this with someone. She couldn't hold it in. Sensei. Sensei would understand. Well, not All Might was talking again, and it pierced her ringing mind. If you'll excuse me, I'm sorry. I never caught your name, he said politely. Chisaki sighed and mustered a shaky smile for her fallen idol. Chisaki Midoriya. Her voice felt heavy as she heaved it from her lungs, and it barely cleared the lump in her throat. My name is Chisaki Midoriya. He stepped forwards with a smile, oblivious to her inner turmoil. Well, it has been a pleasure, young Midoriya. But I have somewhere I need to be. He reached for her hands, for the suit that sagged, hollow, in her hands. She let him take it. Thank you once again. Stay safe out there, Tashinori said with a friendly wave, before he turned and stepped out into the street. She blinked, and he was gone. She stared after him in quiet, earth-shattered grief. The alley felt empty without him there to torment her. The knowledge of the truth weighed heavy on her mind. The air felt thick in her lungs. Her notebook hung empty in her hands. She had forgotten the autograph. She sighed and stared down at the tattered, singed pages in defeat. It probably wasn't worth it anyway. Maybe she should have asked him if she could be a hero. Chisaki trudged homewards in a haze of distress. What was she supposed to do now? Everything was different. She didn't want to go home. She didn't want to face her mom. She'd ask questions. She wouldn't understand the answers. She needed someone who would understand. Sensei. She had Kurogiri's number. She could call him. See if he could bring her back to talk to Sensei. She pulled out her phone and called the number under the contact, bartender boy. She felt her spirits lift a bit when she saw the contact name. Awa. Good old personal jokes. He picked up almost immediately. Hello? Hey Kurogiri, it's me Chisaki. It took every last shred of energy to actually make her voice come out. Is there any way that I could talk to Sensei today? I know that you guys are probably busy with your villain stuff, but I have something that I really need to talk to him about. There was a pause. It was just for a second, but it was enough for her words to hit her. She was actually asking a villain to take her to his boss, as if she were asking a teacher about an essay she'd submitted. Fuck. If it's that important, I can pick you up at 4. Would the same park as yesterday work all right? Why, yes, thank you. That would be great. Good to hear. I will see you then. She breathed a sigh of relief. See you then. There was a click as he hung up, and Chisaki was left alone with her thoughts. Thoughts that suddenly sent her legs shaking. Chisaki held the phone in her hand with a loose-fingered grip. Her legs were now shaking so bad that she was afraid that they would give out completely. What is wrong with me? I probably just need to sit down. She staggered her way over to a bench along the side of the park and collapsed onto it. As she sank down onto the bench, her phone began to vibrate. She spared a glance at the screen. It was her mom. She let it ring. It began as a prickling in her chest, as the shock of the situation wore off and the gravity of the revelations sunk in. All Might is not All Might. All Might is a crippled stick of a man. My whole world has been a lie. My hopes and dreams of heroism, a simple fanfare for an actor and a fraud. Chisaki frowned and shook her head, reevaluating her thought. Well, maybe not a fraud. He has genuinely succeeded in protecting the people and seems to care about the people he serves. At least enough to know how the reality would break their hearts. In the same way that it's breaking mine. She gave a groan of regret and pulled her knees up to her chest. Her throat began to close up, as it often did before a panic attack. She was beginning to shake now too. Why did I follow him? I should have just left All Might alone. I wish I'd never met Tashinori Yagi. I want my naivete back. I want to go back to thinking that everything would be fine, just as long as All Might was the #1 hero. I want to go back to thinking that I could be a hero. Chisaki's eyes stung with tears, and she buried her face in her arms. I want to believe in heroism. That if I could be selfless like All Might, I deserve to be a hero. That just as long as I kept a steady heart and thought about other people, that it would be possible. Tears streamed down her face. But to be a hero, you have to be strong, pretty, and popular. I can't be any of those stupid things. I don't have a quirk. I'm not anyone important. My dream of becoming a hero was justified only by the thought that a good person makes a good hero. I was such an idiot. Such an idiot. I still am. Chisaki jumped as something buzzed against her leg. She picked up her head cautiously, wiping at her eyes and her nose as she dragged her gaze to the bench. Her phone was ringing again. I should really answer that. She picked up the phone cautiously, wiping at her nose again and giving a sniffle. It was her mom, yet again. Chisaki cleared her throat and tested her voice. Good, I probably look like a mess, but at least I don't sound like I've been crying. She whispered to herself with a pitiful little chuckle as she swiped at her nose again. She sat up straight and took a second to collect herself, before sliding her finger across the screen and picking up. Hey Mom, she said slowly, unsure of how her mother would respond. Honey, are you okay? You didn't go near the fight by the train station, did you? The news stations are broadcasting footage from the scene. It looks so horrible. Oh, you didn't get hurt, right? Why didn't you pick up? I was getting so scared, thinking of you trapped in one of those burning buildings. She paused for a moment and Chisaki just stared, dazed, at the gravel around her feet. Honey, you are okay, right? Chisaki blinked and drew herself out of her daze. Oh, yeah, I'm fine. I didn't go anywhere near the burning buildings. Besides, when I got there, the firefighters had already put out most of the fires. She lied. Her mother gave an audible sigh of relief. Thank God. I almost had a heart attack. Just pick up earlier. I think I lost a year or two of my life just now, she said with a flippant laugh. Chisaki sent back a feeble chuckle. I'll see you soon, Mom. I'm already on my way home. Great. Are you hungry? I can warm up some soup if you want some. Sure, Mom. That sounds, great. Okay then, see you soon. Bye. Bye, honey. There was a click and the line went dead. Chisaki sighed and rubbed her eyes before standing up, ready to drag herself home. 15 minutes later, she was opening her front door, perfectly composed and smiling. Hey Mom, I'm back, she said as she walked into the entryway. Is that soup still warm? Of course, honey. Her mom called from inside the house. Chisaki found her mom in the kitchen, smiling as she stirred a warming pot of soup. Inko turned away from the stove at the sight of her daughter, beaming. Welcome home, honey. You were in such a rush earlier that you didn't get breakfast, and since it's almost lunchtime, I thought that you must be ravenous. Thanks, Mom, I am pretty hungry, Chisaki said, smiling as her mom served her a bowl of soup. You were so excited earlier. So, did you do what you needed to do? Yes, Chisaki said, taking a stiff bite of food. I just wanted to get some notes about the fighting. Her mother's face brightened as she took a seat across from her daughter, a bowl of soup in her own hand. I heard that All Might showed up. Did you see him? A cold shock ran down Chisaki's spine. Why did she have to mention him? A lump rose in her throat. What do I say? I shouldn't let her see that I'm nervous about All Might. Chisaki smiled extra wide, so much so that it forced her despondent eyes closed, and she set her voice into a high pitch of excitement, making sure to move her hands in an exaggerated motion. He was so cool. He was only there for a few seconds, but he defeated both the villains, and then he just disappeared. It was just amazing. I'm so glad to hear that. You just love All Might so much. I can only imagine how happy you are, Inko said with a smile. I'm really glad that I saw him today, Chisaki exclaimed childishly. Then she looked down at her soup and felt her stomach turn in revulsion. Mom, you know what? I'm not all that hungry anymore. I think I'll go take a shower, she said in that same forced elation as before. Okay, honey, her mother said, still smiling. Chisaki stood and did her best to hide her shaking hands as she walked past her mom. I need to get away from her. I can't take any more questions. I just need to get to my room, to my safe space, where I can relax. Chisaki was just a step from her room, 2 feet from safety, when her mom's voice came from behind her. Honey? Chisaki's heart jumped into her throat. Did she notice that I was faking my smiles? Does she know that something is wrong? Actually, I'm going to head out in a minute. I'm going to meet up with Katsuki's mom. I probably won't be back before dinner. Are you going to be okay on your own? Chisaki looked over her shoulder and forced a smile. Of course, Mom. When Inko didn't respond immediately, Chisaki took the opportunity to dart into her room. She closed the door behind her and let her smile drop. God damn it. She thought in anger. Her legs started to shake and a sob began rising in her throat. I can't take this. Of course, I can't show her how upset I am. She would get worried and start pestering me, and then she'd ask about All Might, and I can't even bear to hear his name right now, much less talk about him. I don't want to talk about All Might, but I need to. I feel like I'm going crazy bottling these thoughts up. She took a deep breath in an attempt to steady herself. I just need to wait until 4. Yeah. Then Kurogiri will pick me up, and I'll be able to talk to Sensei again. He'll understand how I'm feeling. He'll let me get these thoughts out to someone, even if he is a questionable character. When 4 p.m. rolled around, Chisaki was at Sakura Park, waiting on a bench and feeling quite anxious. She looked around curiously, expecting a black portal to materialize suddenly before her, but no such thing occurred. For a moment, she worried that Kurogiri would simply never come to pick her up. Then, her phone rang. She picked up immediately. Where are you? She asked in a forced calm. It's nice to hear from you, Kurogiri said in that polite way he had. If you would please look to your left. Chisaki did as she was instructed, very much confused. Now, you'll see a woodshed. The one with the broken window? She asked. Yes. Go behind it on the left side. That's where you'll see my portal. Chisaki stood and walked over to the shed, around the left side. And there it was. The rather intimidating-looking, swirling pool of black. Found it. I'll see you in a second, Chisaki said as she hung up and stepped through the vortex. When she emerged, she attempted to reorient herself. She was in the same bar that she had been in yesterday, but Sensei was not there, nor was Kurogiri. The only soul was a figure in a black hoodie, perched on a stool. He was hunched over the bar, fixated on a phone which sat on the bar top, leaning against a cup of steaming coffee. Is that Jurin? No, Jurin doesn't sit like that, Chisaki thought, surprised by this strange character. Then who else could it be? Oh, there was a fourth guy yesterday. The one who didn't want to look at me. What was his name again? Shashigaki Kimura, right? No, that doesn't sound right. Shigaraki? Oh, Shigaraki. There we go. Chisaki looked at the man again. He hadn't stirred, but was now tapping irritatedly at the phone, and had not seemed to notice her entry or inactivity in the least. For a moment she just stood there dumbly, unsure of what to do with herself in the presence of someone who had before expressed such disinterest in her that she could have easily believed that he hated her. You, S.H. Shigaraki, right? She began awkwardly, in an attempt to test the ice. The man stopped his tapping and stiffened, but made no further acknowledgement that he had heard her. I, thought that I was supposed to be meeting with Sensei, Chisaki started, as she began to fidget nervously with the sleeves of her shirt. Would you happen to know where I could find him? Shigaraki gave an agitated, almost angry, growl of impatience. He turned towards her suddenly and shot her a glare. For a moment Chisaki thought that he was going to shout something at her, but then he stopped himself, looked away, and instead said, in a very calm voice, I have been instructed to entertain you while Sensei takes care of something, he said through gritted teeth. Oh, was all Chisaki could say, taken aback. A moment of awkward silence passed between them. Shigaraki staring at some point off to his left, his posture stiff, and Chisaki's eyes wandering around uncomfortably. "Well, may I sit next to you?" Chisaki asked, trying to gauge Shigaraki's reaction. Shigaraki gave no perceptible reaction, but after a second he gave a grunt of assent and turned around, back to his phone. "Well, now what do I do with myself? He obviously doesn't want me anywhere near him, but I can't keep standing here. So, I guess that I'll just sit down. I mean, he gave me some kind of okay, so he won't get mad at me, right?" She approached the bar stiffly. She eyed a stool a seat over from Shigaraki and sat down gingerly. For a moment she expected this man in the hoodie to explode again, but when he didn't even acknowledge her existence, Chisaki relaxed, content to wait until Sensei was ready. This Shigaraki kid seems like a pretty angry guy. Explosive personality and all that. He's kinda like Kachan. This thought brought a wave of revulsion up her throat. Nah, Kachan has his own level of douchiness. Chisaki let her eyes wander to Shigaraki's face as her thoughts drifted. The longer she looked at his face, the more she noticed certain things. He has scars. She thought in startled wonder, seeing a faint scar going over his right eye and a more noticeable one bisecting his lips. I wonder what those are from. Is there a story there? Should I ask him? No, he would probably yell at me. I wonder if he's getting enough sleep. His eyes are so sunken in, and his lips are absolutely shredded. Those are definite signs of stress. She gave a sigh. He looks like he could use a good night of sleep and some chapstick. So, I guess, well, never mind. He's nothing like Kachan. Kachan is always so egocentric. It's always his care above everyone else's needs. I'd say that this guy is definitely carrying his own baggage and some kind of responsibility. Didn't Kurogiri mention something like that yesterday? Sensei also mentioned a protege to carry on his dream. Shigaraki couldn't be his protege, right? If he is, then he has a really long way to go to being a good leader. He should start with being nicer to people. What are you looking at? Shigaraki asked with a cold anger, making Chisaki jump. She didn't know what to say to him, and when she didn't respond immediately, he gave her a deep glare. What? You think I look like a monster, don't you? It wasn't really a question. It was an accusation. You think I look like a freak. He was looking at her now with such revulsion that Chisaki's mind was sent reeling. Where did this come from? What did I do? Yeah, I thought so. He scoffed at her and turned away. You're just a spineless, conformist nobody. I really don't understand what Sensei sees in you, he said with a disdainful shake of his head. Chisaki's expression hardened and anger boiled up from her gut, indignant. I may be a Nobodib, but am no spineless conformist. In fact, I didn't think that you looked like a freak at all. Instead, I was just thinking that perhaps you were someone who had been through something. That maybe you could use a break from some stress I couldn't see. But I guess that I'll just be taking that back then. If you're going to make a judgment on my character, after only having spoken 2 words to me, then don't expect me to make a kind judgment on yours. She spat at the boy. Shigaraki stared at her in narrow-eyed suspicion, fury bubbling just under his skin. Oh, and what makes you think that you're any more worthy to pass a judgment on me than I on you? He said in a barely contained rage. Shit. Now he's angry. Why did I even open my big mouth? I'm not saying that. Chisaki said slowly, before looking away, attempting to avoid a further escalation. I shouldn't have said anything. Now he's angry, and I'm stuck here with him. Then what are you saying? He spat at her. If you don't even know that, then how can you expect to convince me? He watched her with cold and spiteful eyes. I was just thinking, that. Chisaki shifted nervously and looked down at her shaking hands, before clenching them into fists. If you judge me, then you should also be prepared to receive judgment. Likewise, if you wanted to avoid harsh judgment, then you should first be inviting and kind. Shigaraki gave a snort of disdain and watched her for a second, scrutinizing her with his little bloodshot eyes. Look, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to offend you," Chisaki exclaimed nervously, trying to fix any damage that she might have caused. "Whatever," Shigaraki said with another snort and a rolling of his eyes before turning around. "I guess that you really are just a wimp." Chisaki watched him turn away, confused and hurt. The silence returned, now thick and menacing. Shigaraki and Chisaki sat side by side, the first entertaining himself gleefully, and the second resigned to a suffocating sense of helplessness. This was how Kurogiri found the pair a few minutes later. "Chisaki," Kurogiri began, while he observed the two apprehensively. Shigaraki hadn't bothered to turn around, and Chisaki had turned around at a blinding speed and was already halfway off her stool, impatient to get away from the bar. "Sensei is ready to see you," he finished, motioning towards the portal behind him. She jumped down quickly, smiling in relief. "Thank you, Kurogiri," Chisaki said before rushing past him and disappearing. A silence now hung between the bartender and the young man. "Well?" Kurogiri asked expectantly after a moment, breaking the silence. "What did you think of her?" Shigaraki sighed, set his phone down, turned around, and rolled his eyes. "I think that Sensei's made a mistake. We can't use a naive, inexperienced child. Especially not one who spouts such flowery things like, if you want people to be nice, go you. Be nice to them first," he said in a cheesy falsetto before giving a snort of contempt. "Send her back to her hero pep rallies or wherever you found her." Kurogiri didn't respond for a moment. Then he sighed and turned away, walking towards the hall. "I think that she'll really surprise you, Shigaraki," he murmured over his shoulder. Chisaki looked around the room to which the vortex had taken her. She was sure that it was the same room that she had been in just yesterday. But the machinery no longer filled the space, and the panels of screens, which covered one of the walls, were all turned off. In the center of the room, a pair of large armchairs and a coffee table had been set up. "Good afternoon, Chisaki," Sensei said warmly from one of the cushioned armchairs. "Have a seat, and we can get to talking." Hello, Sensei," she began slowly as she took the seat across from him. She had been waiting to speak to him all day, but now that she was here in front of him, she didn't know what to say. I see that you are not hooked up to your machine today," she said nervously, her eyes trained on her hands. Sensei smiled kindly. "Yes, and I apologize for my tardiness. It takes hours of preparation and work for me to spend even an hour away from it. I just wanted to have a nice talk with you, away from all of the cables and equipment." He was watching her now, with a keen but earnest interest. "Well, that's enough about me. How are you?" he asked gently. Chisaki didn't respond, still unsure of what to say to him or where to start. Seeing Chisaki's mute reaction, Sensei instead supplemented some information in an attempt to coax a reaction out of her. "Kurogiri told me that your voice was shaking when you spoke with him earlier. Can you tell me the reason for that?" Chisaki's face turned red, and she looked up suddenly. Oh, I didn't even realize I was doing that." Chisaki began with a feeble little chuckle. "That's a pretty good place to start," she thought. She paused for a moment, before springing into action with a sheepish smile. "Well, you see, I found something out this morning," she said quickly, before a realization hit her and her smile dropped, the color draining from her cheeks. "What am I doing? I'm just going to tell a villain about All Might's crippling weakness. No, that's just insane. There's no way that I can tell a villain about this, even if that villain is Sensei. But if not Sensei, then who? Should I just keep this to myself and keep suffering? Keep letting this tear me apart? It's only been, a few hours, and I already feel like I'm going to burst. Just imagine days, weeks, months, years, to never be able to tell anyone that the idol of our generation is a liar and a fraud. That's absolutely unimaginable. Would it be so bad to tell just Sensei then? Maybe I can make him promise not to spread this information. But if this gets out, there will be mass riots and chaos. Isn't that exactly what a villain would want? Does Sensei want that? Chizaki, a voice asked in concern. She snapped her head up, startled, to see Sensei leaning towards her. His scarred face twisted in concern. Are you doing all right? He asked softly. You've gone as pale as a ghost. If this thing is really weighing on you that much, then you should talk about it all the more. Chizaki swallowed nervously and looked away. That's just the thing. I don't think that I can talk about it because it's such a big deal. She stuttered, unsure. What do you mean? He asked with a raise of his hairless brow. She bit her lip and scanned Sensei's face, uncertain. If I tell you, I need you to promise to keep this a secret from, well, everyone. Sensei sat back in his chair and watched her for a moment, his head cocked to the side as he thought. Very well, I can agree to that, he said with a steady nod. Chizaki gave a sigh of relief and relaxed. Now tell me, he said kindly, what is troubling you? She took a moment to arrange her thoughts. Where do I start with this? She began nervously, unsure of how she should approach this topic. It's about All My. Her voice caught in her throat at his name. About All My, she decided to try again, confused. All M. It wasn't getting any better, and now her eyes were burning with tears. Come on, stupid voice. Why can't I say his name? It's just a name. It's not a big deal. Just say it. All My. This time she was cut off by a vicious sob that had erupted from her chest. Oh God, what the hell is wrong with me? Chisaki exclaimed as she buried her face, now dripping with fresh tears, into her shaky hands. Forget about his name, Sensei said calmly, his tone concerned but gentle. Just tell me what you found out about All Might. Chisaki took a shuddering breath from behind her hands and removed them from her face with a sniffle. Why, yes, she said shakily as she swiped at her eyes. She took a deep breath to steady herself a bit and launched in with the conclusion. Hysant all-powerful, he was severely wounded in a fight 7 years ago, and now he's been reduced to a weak and feeble state. Now the words were beginning to tumble out in a rush, like water rushing through a hole in a dam, widening the hole into a crack, and growing until the dam collapsed under the pressure. Tears were squeezing out of the corners of her eyes, but the words had taken on a life of their own, and she couldn't stop them now. Him that we see on TV is just the scraping together of what's left of his power. But it's all a deception. We won't be safe when a real emergency appears, because he won't be able to defend us. Our safety is just an illusion. And, even worse, I don't think that All Might will recover in this lifetime. So we're never going to be as safe as we think we are. And, of course, I'm telling all of this to a villain. That sounds like some kind of moral sin. I'm just handing a villain the secret to defeating, if not killing, the #1 hero, the protector of peace. That's insane, isn't it? I don't even know why I'm doing this. Chisaki, Sensei said calmly, cutting through her hysterical raving. It's okay, he said with a gentle, sad smile. I already know. She stared at him for a moment, frozen in surprise, and all she could get out was a hollow. Oh. Then tears sprung to her eyes. Oh, thank God, she exclaimed in relief, and she gave a shameful, choked sob. I don't know what I would have done with myself if what I had said had somehow led to him getting killed. But I couldn't just not say anything to anyone. I couldn't handle a secret like that. Sensei smiled reassuringly to her. Well, I'm glad that you told me. A troubled look flashed across his face. But for you, a pretty standard civilian, to find this out so easily, Toshinori must really be getting sloppy, he said pensively. Do you know Allum? She paused for a moment, looking frustrated but determined, and took a deep breath. All Might. Well, I don't know him on a personal level, Sensei said in this calm and thoughtful way, as if he were picking his words carefully. Chisaki found this small mannerism surprisingly comforting. But he and I have been opposing each other for the past 7 or 8 years, and you come to know someone pretty well after clashing with them for so long. So, I would say that I know him pretty well. 7 or 8 years, huh? Chisaki said softly, a vague memory creating an itch in a corner of her mind, distracting her from the emotional crash from just a few moments before. Yesterday, you said that you were injured 7 years ago. All Might said that he was injured at the same time. Curious. Sensei's brows rose in momentary surprise, before settling, and his pale lips lifted at the corners, a knowing little smile sprouting on them. And, he asked, his tone was almost taunting or coy. Would you like to draw any conclusions? Chisaki watched his reactions with confusion. Conclusions? She asked, perplexed, before her green eyes went wide with realization, and she almost jumped up in surprise. You knew about All Might's injury and weakness because you caused it. You and All Might fought 7 years ago. A pleased smile spread across Sensei's lips. Yes, perfect. He glanced behind Chisaki for a moment, before returning his gaze to her. Why isn't your fight recorded anywhere? That must have been a massive battle, you and All Might fighting toe-to-toe, she said, bright-eyed and excited just imagining it. Sensei gave a humorous little laugh from deep in his chest. A great fight indeed. You know, that little deductive ability of yours is quite impressive. Something like that can't be learned, nor taken lightly. It's a very valuable trait in this dangerous world of ours. A figure appeared from behind Chisaki and Sensei turned to face them. Oh, why hello there, Kirigiri. Would that happen to be tea? Yes, an Earl Grey, the bartender said as he approached. Sensei and Chisaki watched as the bartender set down a tray with a customary homely tea set, complete with a pair of tacky mugs, an old tea kettle, and 2 containers of what Chisaki assumed to be milk and sugar. Well, thank you, Kirigiri, Sensei said graciously. You are very welcome, sir, Kirigiri said courteously. I did not intend to intrude. Chisaki watched him as he retreated, curious and a little bit worried, unsure of how long he had been near. She suddenly felt like he could have witnessed something private, something raw and unfiltered. How would you like your tea? Sensei asked kindly. He was leaning over the tea set, pouring the steamy, dark tea into the mugs. A full scoop of sugar and a dash of milk, she said absent-mindedly as she turned around. Got it, he responded. As he scooped in the sugar, he kept talking. You know what? I like doing these little things. Even though I can't live like I used, and I can't leave my house, it's nice to be able to have discussions like this and just play host for a few hours. It's strange to think that I was someone who was feared at one point in my life. I like to think that if life were a video game, I would have been the last boss. But here I am now, sitting and serving tea to an astute young woman. Chisaki gave a light little laugh. Well, thank you for the compliment, Sensei. It feels like such high praise coming from you. She gave an airy sigh. It's kind of strange for me to think about too. If you had told me a week ago that I was going to be having tea with Sensei, the man who has inspired me for the past 6 years, and that he was the villain who crippled All Might, I would have called you crazy and called the police, she said with a laugh. Sensei smiled too, and gave the teas a stir with a spoon, before pouring a dash of milk into each. Chisaki, this is for you, he said as he offered a mug to her. She found herself smiling wide as she accepted it. Thank you, she said, noticing that there was a little drawing of an apple on the side of the mug, the kind of red apple that you would see on a teacher's desk. It made her wonder if Sensei had ever been a real sensei, like a proper teacher. She tried to imagine him standing at the front of a classroom, trying to explain polynomials to teenagers, and found a laugh bubbling up from her chest. The two enjoyed the comfortable silence for a moment. Chisaki held her mug snugly between her hands. It's strange, she began thoughtfully. Now I just feel so light, so much lighter than I did before. It's so bizarre because I've lost my idol, and I don't know what I'm going to do with myself after this. But I'm not really worried about it, she said as a bright smile spread across her face. What do you mean? Sensei asked with a tilt of his head, cradling his own mug as if to absorb its warmth. Well, my whole life, heroes have been my crutch. I've only been able to drag myself through the daily torment, through the bullying from my only friend and the lying to my mom, because I was sure that one day I would become a hero. Because there was always that promise that no matter what happened in my life, the heroes would always fix things in the end. All Might was the sign that I could achieve my dream, that being a good person would make me a hero, just like him. But now, most of that is worthless, debatable at best. And I guess that, on some level, that's okay. Reality is hard and cold. It's not a light, fluffy dream where you can be expected to be shielded from pain. She said it with a small, almost airy laugh. Sensei raised his brow in amusement. Well, that was rather dark. He shifted in his chair, crossing his legs. This posture reminded Chisaki of a businessman she had seen on a TV show a while ago. So, what do you think that you'll do with yourself from here on out, without your blind faith in heroes? Chisaki took a long sip from her mug of tea as she pondered the question, her eyes fixed blankly on the coffee table and her smile frozen at half-mast. I guess that I'll probably go to an average high school, then an average college, and later get an average office job in some small company somewhere. I'll probably just end up living my life quietly, all the while with a secret fear of the world's collapse, knowing that the system and the heroes are fundamentally flawed. Sensei raised an eyebrow. That sounds rather painful, suffering in silence for the rest of your life. Are you sure that that's what you want? He asked almost coyly. Want? She asked without looking at him, a sad smile playing across her lips. No, but it's probably what I'll get. I'm quirkless, so what else can I do with myself? She swirled the contents of her mug and watched the milk float through the steamy, pungent tea. She stopped for a moment and cocked her head. What I want is to change things. I want to be someone, not just Chisaki Midoriya, the quirkless fool. She gave a deep sigh. I used to think that this person that I wanted to become was a hero, someone like All Might. But I don't think that I want to anymore. Heroism, the fighting for people, has always been appealing, but I'm no hero. I don't think that I can be. So why not become your own kind of hero? Sensei posed. Chisaki's looked up slowly, dumbfounded. What do you mean? Well, you could join me, he said, his eyes doing the watching without eyes thing. Chisaki thought that it should have been unnerving. More specifically, join my league and work with us to change things, as you put it. This world is broken and twisted. The hero system is flawed and falling apart. And I think that both you and I know that sitting on our asses and enduring isn't going to solve the problem. Chisaki bit her lip, her mind in turmoil over this proposal. That's a big offer. It's life-changing. It would mean joining a group of villains after all. But join Sensei. That doesn't sound too bad. Actually, that sounds great. Sensei acknowledges me as more than just a crippled, quirkless little girl. Besides, I feel perfectly at home here, and everyone here seems much more welcoming than anyone in the normal world. Except for maybe Shigaraki. But I think that we just got off on the wrong foot. Kurogiri, on the other hand, is kind and polite, and Jiren doesn't seem too bad. All of these people are certainly leagues better than someone like Kachon. They may be villains, but they are better people than the person most praised to become a hero of our generation. That's about as ironic as irony can get. Besides, I agree with Sensei here. We need to change things, so that people like Kachon don't get praised as heroes, while people like me get stepped on. So that security isn't an illusion from a bunch of media-centric, glorified celebrities. This society is wrong, and Sensei and his friends might be the way to change it. So, this raises the question. Just what would joining Sensei's group entail? First of all, would joining mean becoming a villain? Would I have to hurt people? Well, you can't expect to change the world without getting your hands dirty. But what about murder? Would I have to become a murderer? Chisaki pursed her lips and voiced her thoughts slowly. As much as I like the idea of changing things, I don't. She gave a sigh, unsure of how to articulate these thoughts. I agree that the world shouldn't be allowed to stay this way. It is definitely twisted and wrong. But joining you would mean becoming a villain, wouldn't it? I'm not sure what that would mean for me. Becoming a criminal at 14, that just sounds a little crazy to me. Mostly, I was just wondering what I would be doing if I were to join you. Would I have to kill people? Sensei let out a low chuckle. Well, you wouldn't have to kill anyone, at least not for a very long time. After all, not all villains are murderers. He cocked his head thoughtfully. As far as your activities would go, you would have a choice in what you tag along for. And you wouldn't get involved in anything too dangerous for a while. After all, we would need to train you before then. Chisaki smiled sheepishly, but continued with more questions. What about my day-to-day life? Would I be able to keep my civilian life as it is? If I agree to this, I'm going to need to keep this a secret from my mother. She would probably have a heart attack if she knew that I was even talking to a villain. She said with a small laugh. Naturally, we would hide your identity. Sensei said with a nod before sipping at his mug of tea. A normal life is something that should be greatly treasured. After all, as soon as someone is recognized as a villain, their life becomes very limited. Sensei said sadly, before looking up and raising his lips into a smile. We can discuss these things at great length at a later date, if you would like that. He suggested. Yes, I would like that. She said with a smile, having reached a conclusion. No matter what the future holds, it will be movement in some direction. Whether it's progress or not is secondary. Anything is better than the life I have now. Then it's decided. Sensei said with a wide smile as he held his hand out, offering a handshake to seal the deal. Chisaki's heart fluttered nervously as she reached out to grip his hand. He shook her hand with surprising strength for a man who had spent the last few years living with the aid cables and machinery. Sensei gave her a last big smile, and it sent a shiver of excitement down her spine. Chisaki Midoriya, welcome to the League of Villains. This world was going to change, and she, Chisaki Midoriya, was about to take her first major step towards creating that change. 3 days later, it still felt unreal. Some part of Chisaki's mind wanted to believe that everything that had happened had simply been a dream, or maybe a nightmare. Within 2 days, she had had her image of villains and heroes completely overturned, found out her idol was really not who he pretended to be, and accepted an offer to join a group of really nice, cool human beings who only kinda sorta happened to be villains. Yeah, it was all just a little bit too crazy to be real, and that's not even mentioning that she almost died. And yet it was real. The idea of joining a league of villains should have been terrifying, or at least off-putting, and yet Chisaki found that it held a sense of adventure and excitement. It was a little rebellion, a secret that someone like Kachan could never take away from her. It was her little safe space. She hoped that maybe this was proof that she was no longer simply a cowardly, quirkless, middle school girl. These were the sorts of thoughts that brought an eager smile to her lips as Chisaki sat in her classroom. It was the last period of the day, and the teacher had long since ceased his attempts to hold the students' attention, and the students, likewise, had long since forgotten to pretend to be interested. Bakugo and his friends had started some betting game in the corner of the classroom. Some girls had formed a small huddle by the windows and had begun to whisper amongst themselves. The rest of the students sat interspersed across the classroom, on their phones or napping with their heads on the desks. By all accounts, the whole scene was a blatant violation of the rules, and on any other day probably would have meant at least a dozen detention slips. But the teacher was too tired to go through the trouble, and the students were all more than content to spend their last period goofing off. Meanwhile, the clock ticked the seconds by, eternity by eternity. Chizaki watched the timepiece on the wall with her eager green eyes, glancing furtively between its face and that of the teacher at the front of the classroom. She had been attempting to keep up with the notes from his ever-dreary lecture, but couldn't help feeling the excitement of release from the stifling classroom. Suddenly, something hit her lightly on the back of her head. She flinched and turned around hesitantly, finding herself face to face with her good friend Bakugo Katsuki, his hand still raised from the throw. "Oh, I'm sorry, Deku," he said with a sneer and a dismissive wave of his hand. "I was hoping to hit the trash can, but I guess that I must have made a mistake. You two look so similar after all." He leaned back, his arms splayed out, palms up. His shoulders twitched in a shrug, and he gave her a condescending little smirk, as looked down his nose at her. "Especially since all you ever do is stink up the place and make things hard for other people." His friends snickered around him like sniveling rats, and Chisaki felt herself sink into herself, wanting to hide and escape, but being completely unable to. "After all, you aren't good for anything except occupying space and wasting oxygen," Katsuki said, his smirk growing with his ego. "Sometimes I pity you. It must feel absolutely horrible to be such a complete waste of space." Chisaki's eyes burned and her stomach seized. She wanted to cry and yell all at once, but knew that she could do neither of those things. Instead, she clenched her jaw and turned back around, her face a mask of timid unresponsiveness. "Yeah, some hero you're going to turn out to be, Kachan," she thought as she glared down at her notes, trying to hold back tears through anger alone. "I can't believe that we were ever even friends. Why do I even bother feeling betrayed anymore? After all, it's not like he'll ever see me as anything more than his emotional punching bag. You know what, Katsuki Bakugo? I hope for the sake of the world that you fail to even get into UA. If you ever became a hero, I'm pretty sure the world would end." She gave a sigh and glanced at the clock. "It's just another 15 minutes. Then you won't have to see him for the rest of the day." She took a deep breath to try and calm herself. Just another 15 excruciating minutes. Let's go back to thinking about Sensei and the League. Yeah, the League. Maybe they will help me change things so that people like Kachan get punished for what they do. Punished? Like how? With violence and pain. Death. She shook her head, banishing the thought. No, nope. We are not going there. Too dark. Let's change the topic. Yeah, I wonder how Jurin's doing. I mean, I didn't get to talk to him that much, but he seemed like a pretty okay guy. He even said that I wasn't creepy when I started ranting on accident. People have been telling me that I look demented for years. Now it's so surprising to just see someone who doesn't mind when I rant. Isn't it weird how someone so accepting can be a villain? Aren't villains supposed to be cruel, vicious, psychopaths? The ringing of the school bell startled Chisaki out of her thoughts. She hurried to get ready to leave and shoved her books in her backpack, all the while tracking Kachan in the corner of her eye. He was still talking with his friends, but she wanted to be out of there before his attention shifted to her. Today Kachan seemed to be in the mood for some emotional release, and if he got the chance, she would become the vessel for that release. Yeah, no thanks, she thought at that notion. I'm getting out of here. She was done packing up, so she yanked her bag off of her desk and threw it over her shoulder as she walked towards the door. She was almost there when Kachan called her name. "Hey Deku, where do you think you're going so soon? I thought that we could have a quick little talk." Chisaki paused for a moment. Her first instinct was to freeze and comply, to avoid any conflict. But then she thought about it. She didn't want to just stand there and let her old friend harass her. So she took a deep breath, set her shoulders, and kept walking. "Deku, Kachan's voice came from behind her in uncharacteristic surprise, before it rang out in rage. Deku, what the fuck are you doing? She started running. It occurred to her that, by tomorrow, he might want revenge for her little rebellion. But she dismissed the thought. So, what if he blows up at me later? She thought in agitation. I just want to get out of here and meet up with Kurogiri. This prick can go fuck himself. Deku, where do you think you're going? He demanded as he charged after her. He was ready to yell a stream of expletives at the girl. But when he got through the door, the hall was empty and Chisaki was nowhere to be seen. You're really going to regret that, you quirkless little shit. How dare you walk away from me? He roared, setting off a string of explosions in the palms of his hands. Chisaki gave a sigh of dread as she barreled down the stairs. She had just barely managed to duck behind a corner and into the staircase when she had heard him shout. Yeah, tomorrow was going to be bad. She was at the park, now sitting on the same bench that she had cried on just a few days before. But instead, she was smiling now, not crying. Today's going to get better, she assured herself. My mom's at the hospital until tomorrow morning, and I get to hang out with Sensei and his group until 9. I just can't wait to see them all again. She was practically dancing in anticipation as she kicked her feet and swaying back and forth on the bench. 10 minutes later, Kurogiri opened his portal behind the shed. This time Chisaki was ready, and she passed through without any difficulties. Hello everyone, she said with a bright smile as she landed in the bar. Jurin and Shigaraki were sitting at the bar, their backs to her at first, and Kurogiri stood behind them, cleaning glasses. Jurin turned around immediately. He had a pleasant little smile on his lips and a cigarette in hand. Hey there, kiddo. How you doing? I'm doing great, she responded with a wide smile as she strolled up to the bar. I heard that you officially joined, Jurin commented as Chisaki took a seat. Congrats on that one. Sensei insists that you will be a big help, he said with a nod and a sideways grin as he took a drag from his cigarette. That sounds like a lot of pressure, Chisaki said with a bubbly laugh. I'm just excited to be here. I'm glad to hear that, Kurogiri said with his smiling eyes. Can I get you anything to drink? He asked kindly. Can you do iced coffee? Of course, he said with a nod as he began to fuss around the backside of the counter. Chisaki looked around, momentarily confused. Are we waiting for anything? Not really, Jurin said lethargically, letting out a lungful of smoke. His elbows were propped on the counter around a glass of gin. Just waiting for Sensei to contact us. Contact us? She asked. How? Through that TV there, he said, nodding to a TV monitor hanging in a corner, just above where Shigaraki was sitting. Kurogiri passed Chisaki her iced coffee, and she took it, barely able to acknowledge it over her surprise. You mean that we won't be meeting with him in person? She asked. Well, of course not, Jurin said with a shake of his head. His health is much too weak to have so many visitors so often. But I met with him before, Chisaki said in disappointment. Is it not possible to meet him again today? Shigaraki gave a snort. This brat, he murmured from his stool. He was hunched over the bar and glaring at her out of the corner of his eye. Doesn't even know how lucky she was to see Sensei even once, he said spitefully. Shigaraki, Kurogiri hissed in warning. You are being very rude. Rude or not, it's true, he said with a shrug, his eyes still trained on Chisaki. You took your time with Sensei for granted. Do you know how long it's been since I've seen Sensei? Shigaraki, Kurogiri chided more forcefully. That's enough. Stop venting at Chisaki. Shigaraki turned his glare to the bartender and opened his mouth to unleash his anger on the man. When the phone rang, everyone froze. Kurogiri turned to pick up the phone, shot a scalding look at Shigaraki from over his shoulder. Yes, Sensei, he said into the receiver as he turned his back to the bar. His expression changed after a moment of listening, and he nodded his head slowly. Yes, sir. I will relay the message to them. Another nod. Thank you, sensei. A pause. Of course, naturally. There was a longer pause and Kurogiri slowly put the receiver on its hook. For a second, he cleared his throat nervously, and then turned to face the three keen faces that watched him. They had all been holding their breath. So? Jiren asked slowly. What did the boss say? Kurogiri sighed. There has been a change of plans. His eyes flickered towards Chisaki for a moment. Unfortunately, we won't be able to give you the tour today. Some of our assets have been breached, and the League has been rendered into a state of emergency. Shigaraki narrowed his eyes. What is it? He asked gravely. What did they hit? I don't think that they necessarily meant to hit anything of ours, Kurogiri said with a frown. It seems that a group of vagrants have barricaded themselves inside one of our warehouses and are attempting to claim the cargo inside. Unfortunately, that warehouse contains a shipment of equipment for the Namu project and… Shigaraki's eyes widened and then narrowed. That's enough, Kurogiri, he interjected, shooting a glare at Chisaki. Don't say anything more. Chisaki looked around in confusion. She had never heard of this Namu project thing and couldn't make heads or tails of it. But Shigaraki seemed to think that she had some kind of use for this information. Kurogiri shook his head. It's okay, Shigaraki. She's become part of the League, so it's perfectly fine that she hears about the project. Shigaraki turned to the bartender in disbelief. Did Sensei say that? Kurogiri nodded his head. Yes. Shigaraki turned beet red. Why? Why would Sensei give this brat such special treatment? I don't think that he is giving her any special treatment at all, the bartender said with a frown, noticing Shigaraki's discomfort. Regardless of what you think, Sensei has placed you in charge of this little rescue operation. Jiren has been charged with the weapons and the grunt work. I will handle the transportation of the goods and whatever else you may need me for. Also, since she has no training, Chisaki is to accompany me. Shigaraki stood abruptly and Chisaki's eyes went wide in astonishment. She's coming along, he exclaimed in outrage. I'm coming along, she said at the same time. The two froze and locked eyes for a moment, shock passing between them, before Shigaraki scowled and hurriedly sat back down. Well, I'm not taking responsibility for her, he grumbled as he turned away. That's fine, Kurogiri said with a humorful little smile. PSH, Jiren exclaimed, a laugh bursting from his lips. You too, oh God, I'm gonna die. Chisaki felt her cheeks flush in embarrassment and tried to change the subject. Won't I be a burden, since I can't do anything? Oh, don't worry about that, kiddo, Jiren said, as he wiped a tear from his eye, still smiling. I'm sure that Kurogiri will take good care of you. Right, the bartender said reassuringly. You and I shouldn't be in any danger. Jiren stood from his bar stool, taking a final drag from his cigarette and crushing the butt into an ashtray. Well, I guess that I should go get the details about this little mission. I'll take the liberty of prepping a few firearms too. He had turned around and was just beginning to walk away when he stopped and abruptly, an idea had occurred to him. Chisaki, do you need anything? A costume or any weapons? Chisaki was, once again, surprised. And no, I don't know. She looked at Kurogiri hurriedly. Do I need anything? He cocked his head thoughtfully. Well, a disguise couldn't hurt. We probably don't have many options though. All right? Jiren said with a grin. I'll see what I can track down then. Let's reconvene in 20. Shigaraki said begrudgingly. I'm going to go breathe some air not contaminated by naivete and childish overdependence. He shot Chisaki a parting glare of disapproval before disappearing through a doorway and slamming the door behind him. With that, Both Shigaraki and Jurin were gone. Does he really hate me that much? Chisaki said quietly. I mean, I know that I haven't done anything to prove myself yet. But does he have to be so harsh? Am I really that useless? I wouldn't worry about it too much, Kirigiri said reassuringly as he leaned against the far counter. Shigaraki doesn't trust people easily. But once he gets used to you, he isn't so bad. Chisaki gave a little humorless laugh. I don't think that he'll ever get used to me. She paused to take a sip of her coffee, a new thought occurring to her. Why do you think he saved me from that sludge villain? I mean, it's not like he had any real reason to save a stranger, right? Kirigiri shrugged. I'm afraid that I don't know the answer. It would be best to ask him yourself, if you ever get the chance. She gave a sigh of defeat. Keyword being if. She finished her drink in silence and watched Kirigiri wash and put away glasses. He didn't look like he was in any hurry, nor as if he were about to go out, fight some dangerous criminals, and reclaim a warehouse. I thought that sensei said that the league was in a state of emergency. Chisaki asked him after a minute. Isn't everyone acting rather calm? Kirigiri gave a chuckle. This isn't the kind of emergency where there is a need for immediate action. So it seems that we have opted to move with care. But you aren't moving at all, Chisaki said, biting her lip nervously. No one is doing anything. Don't you go worrying about our pace, kiddo, Jurin said with a smile as he appeared behind her. He was carrying a cardboard box, and when he approached, he set it onto the bar top. I brought out all of our spare clothes, most of its old bartender uniforms. I think that this set should fit you, he said as he pulled out a vest top and a red tie. We could give you this blouse, but all of our pants are too long. I assume that you'll be okay with just wearing your skirt for today. He glanced at Chisaki to assess her response. She nodded emphatically. She had always dreamt of having a costume, and even if this was a villain costume and not a hero one, the idea of having her very own disguise was still thrilling. Good, Jurin said, leaning back into the box and pulling something out. I also found a gas mask. It might work to cover your face until we find a better option, he said as he laid it on the counter. Chisaki picked up the article and held it with care. Its black plastic looked old and worn on the edges, but the glass lenses were still intact, and they were slightly tinted. Chisaki assumed that it would make it harder to recognize her face through them. Oh yes, that one, Kirigiri said as he gazed over the bar top and into Chisaki's hands. That relic may look battered, but it should still work. Jurin gave a snort. We wouldn't have kept it otherwise. Chisaki found herself smiling down at the old thing. What are you three doing in here? Shigaraki said coldly from behind them. This isn't the time to be playing dress-up. Chisaki went rigid in surprise. We were just getting Chisaki something to wear, Kirigiri said calmly. Well, you're wasting your time, Shigaraki grumbled in annoyance. We need to get ready to head out. I've composed a plan of action. Kirigiri, you're going to take us to the observation room on the second floor of the warehouse. That will give us a decent vantage point and access to the security cameras. Jurin, I'm assuming that you have your weapons. Jurin gave a nod. Good. You're going to go first and neutralize any threats that may be present. Come back through and notify us when you're done. Then the rest of us will pass through. And from there, we will reassess the situation and decide what to do next, he said, passing a glance around the group. Are we all clear? Chisaki clutched her mask and bit her lip. What do you want me to do? She said nervously. You will do your best to stay out of the way, he hissed, his eyes narrowed in revulsion. Know that you are only coming along because Sensei ordered it. If you get weak-kneed or break down at the sight of blood, I'm leaving you behind. Now, go change your clothes or whatever it is you need to do. We're leaving in 5. Kirigiri shot Shigaraki a look of disapproval before turning to Chisaki. I will show you to a place where you can change, he said kindly. Thank you, she said, avoiding eye contact as she picked up the clothes on the counter. Kurogiri led her to a bathroom in the back of the bar and waited outside for her to change. Chisaki dressed hurriedly and got a brief look at herself in the mirror, just as she secured the gas mask over her face. There stood a girl, but you wouldn't know if she was a girl if not for the skirt, who looked shaky, nervous, and out of place. The long sleeves of the blouse had been unreasonably long, so she rolled them up to her biceps. This left a contradictory look to the neat vest and suit idea, especially when paired with her mess of a tie. The only two things that seemed to fit her well were the vest and the mask. Everything else hung limply off her frame, hiding whatever few feminine features she had. You still look like a wimp, she thought sourly. Well, at least you don't look like Chisaki Midoriya. That's a plus. Well, actually, you only look different-ish. If someone who really knew you saw that green hair, they would probably be able to recognize you immediately. Maybe if I carry myself differently, I won't be as easy to recognize. Chisaki took a deep breath and set her shoulders. The figure in the mirror unfurled a bit from its stoop, but it was undeniably still Chisaki Midoriya. That's not that much better. I still look like a shaky disaster, she thought with a sigh of defeat. Suddenly, she felt a rush of groundless courage and shook her head resolutely. No, you know what? You're going to do this. Show Shigaraki up and prove him wrong. You're not a useless wimp. A knock came from the door and Chisaki froze. Chisaki, are you all right in there? It was Kurogiri. You've been in there a while and Shigaraki is starting to get impatient. Oh, she exclaimed in surprise. I'm coming. She was almost startled to find that her voice was slightly muffled and distorted behind the mask. I was just having some trouble with the tie. She lied before thrusting open the door and stepping out into the hall. How do I look? She asked, grinning nervously behind her mask. Kurogiri admired her costume for a second. That doesn't look too bad, he said with a nod of approval. If you don't mind, may I fix that tie? Chisaki smiled awkwardly and stood still as he redid her mess of a knot. There, he said, standing back. That looks much better. Let's get back to the bar then, he announced, and he began to lead her back the way they had come. They entered the bar to find Jurin leaning against the counter and Shigaraki hunched over on one of the stools. The latter was covered in the dismembered hands that Chisaki vaguely remembered from the first day she had met him. What took you two so long? He snapped as he turned to them. I'm sorry. I took a long time changing, Chisaki said nervously. Whatever, he growled, standing up. We've already wasted enough time. Kurogiri, open your warp gate. Yes, sir, Kurogiri said, summoning up the black portal. Jurin, Shigaraki said over his shoulder. Jurin gave a nod, drew his gun, and passed through. Kurogiri went to stand next to Shigaraki, bending down to whisper something in his ear. Shigaraki in turn made a face of shock, and then shifted to discomfort as Kurogiri spoke. Chisaki couldn't help but feel awkward as she stood there in the middle of the bar. She always seemed to end up standing uncomfortably in the middle of the bar. I wonder what he's saying to him. Is it about me? Should I be worrying about what to do next? This just started so suddenly. I didn't expect that we would go straight into the battle. I hope that Jurin's doing okay. Just then, Jurin popped back into the bar, emerging from the portal looking no worse for wear. All clear, he reported. Good, Shigaraki said, standing and walking towards the portal. Just as he was about to step through, he paused and turned to Chisaki, not quite meeting her eyes. Make sure to wait for a minute before you walk through. Oh, okay, she said, stunned as she watched him disappear. What did he mean by that? She asked, looking at Kurogiri. I am not sure, he said elusively. What could that mean? Does it have anything to do with what they talked about? After a moment, and the bartender stepped forward. We should go through. Oh, okay, Chisaki said, flustered, dragging her eyes to the wall of shifting black smoke. What's going to be on the other side? Are there going to be corpses? Jurin did take a gun. Would we have heard a gunshot if he had used it? No, probably not. I don't think that sound carries through these portals. So, does that mean that Jurin could have just killed someone? If I go through there, am I going to see dead bodies? Is there going to be a lot of blood? No. Stop psyching yourself out. You're going to have to go through there whether you like it or not. It won't be any different than the hero fights. You've seen plenty of gore at those. Now you're just going to be a little bit closer to it. That's all it is. Chisaki, Kurogiri asked expectantly from behind her. You need to walk through, he said gently. All right, she said, taking a deep breath. She forced one foot in front of the other, bracing herself for the gore. She shut her eyes tight as she passed through the gate, opening them hesitantly when she felt herself reach the other side. She shouldn't have been so scared. There was no gore awaiting her. In fact, the room was impeccably tidy, save for some suspicious piles of ash and a fallen chair. Instead of a mass of blood and corpses, Chisaki was facing a wall of TV monitors, each screen showing footage of what she assumed to be the warehouse. It was the kind of room that security guards used in movies, which Chisaki found almost comically mundane. Shigaraki and Jurin were standing by a door and speaking in hushed tones, no doubt planning their next course of action. Kurogiri appeared behind her suddenly and quickly closed the portal. He glanced around, his gaze lingering on the piles of ash longer than Chisaki thought it should have. But he didn't comment on them, so she decided not to voice any questions about the oddities. Shigaraki looked up, gracing their arrival with an impassive glance. I can see that you two made it just fine. I've been wanting to get to work, he said, a spark lighting in his eyes and a blood-curdling grin twisting across his lips. Let's make this entertaining. Sneaking around and hunting them down one by one would be too easy, too boring. I want to crush them so completely that they'll never be able to stand again. Literally, Shigaraki said, fixing Kurogiri with his crazed eyes and leaning against the doorframe. We're going to use your quirk to drop them from as high up as possible. From what I remember, the ceiling of this warehouse is rather tall, so even if the fall doesn't kill them, it'll at least cripple them. Chisaki flinched as Shigaraki continued on. How could he casually mention brutally crippling, possibly mortally wounding people? This was a merciless act of violence, and he was excited about it. She glanced at Kurogiri, looking for any acknowledgement of this fear. But he was watching Shigaraki ramble on, and his expression hadn't changed. A knot tightened in her stomach. Her eyes flew to Jurin, who noticed her and gave her a little reassuring grin, but showed no sign of sharing in her distress. They were villains. How else had she expected them to react to this? Chisaki swallowed over the lump in her throat and forced herself to tune back into what Shigaraki was saying. She at least wanted to know what was going to happen. Jurin and I will be on the ground, taking care of anyone you aren't able to. But we're still going to need you to be our eyes. Use the cameras to watch for anyone we miss and inform us, he said, still speaking to Kurogiri with a wolfish grin. He turned to Jurin. You made sure to grab the comms units right? Jurin gave a nod. Make sure everyone gets one, Shigaraki said, his gaze rolling over the other three members, quickly settling on Chisaki. His red eyes narrowed and any glee that had been there fell away. Honestly, I don't know why you're even here, but senseis told me that you're supposed to be observant or something. So just stay with Kurogiri and try to make yourself useful, he said icily, before turning his back to her and walking away. He slouched over the table and began to study the feed on the screens, oblivious to Chisaki's blank-eyed stare boring into his back. She just couldn't understand what he wanted from her. 1 minute he was telling her that she was useless and naive, and the next that she should try to help. Maybe it was his horrible personality that made her so confused. He was cold, cruel, and almost psychopathic in his disregard for others. Yet he had been managing this impromptu team with ease despite his unsociable disposition. And he had even managed to say something to her that wasn't quite an insult. Was this possibly an opportunity? Yeah, Chisaki decided this was, and she was going to prove to him that she wasn't as useless as he thought she was. That she could be of use to someone. That she wasn't the burden people like Kachon insisted that she was. You all good? A raspy voice asked from right beside her, shaking Chisaki out of her reverie. She looked over and found Jiren staring at her, a cigarette held between his fingers. The smoke suddenly caught in her throat, and she gave a cough. I'm fine. He watched her for a second, while he took a drag from his cigarette, frowning. If it's about Shigaraki, we told you already. Ignore him, and don't take it personally. He's always grumpy. Why, yeah, I know, she said sheepishly, looking back at the same villain. She couldn't help it. He obviously wanted nothing to do with her, and yet there was something intriguing about him. Was intriguing the right word? Jiren, Kirigiri exclaimed. Chisaki turned around just in time to see him retch the cigarette out of his hand. Kirigiri crushed it in his hand indignantly. What if you had set off the fire alarms? Sorry. Jiren said, waving his hand dismissively. I needed a little pick-me-up. Well, be more careful, Kirigiri said, massaging his forehead with a sigh, before suddenly looking up again. By the way, what happened with the comms units? Oh, right, that, Jiren said, fishing in his pocket. Here, he said, passing an earpiece to Kirigiri. One for you. He turned to Chisaki and handed her another. One for you, one for me, and one for the grumpy man, he said as he popped one into his own ear and held the last in his hand. Oh, let me turn that on for you, Jiren said, taking Chisaki's earpiece and pushing a button on it. Just as he was handing it back to her, and Chisaki was about to thank him, a perpetually angry voice came from behind her. Who are you calling grumpy? Shigaraki said with a glare at Jiren. No one, Jiren said with a weak attempt at a smile. Your earpiece, he said in offering, his hand outstretched. Shigaraki's narrowed eyes told Chisaki that he knew exactly who Jiren had been talking about. But instead of commenting on it, he took the comms unit and jammed it into his ear. Whatever, he said dismissively, his scowl deepening only further. Let's get going. The idiots downstairs have started to look through the goods. We can't afford to sit up here any longer. He turned from Jiren to Kirigiri. Open us a portal to the far left corner of the warehouse. We'll start the ground assault from there. As soon as we're through, start dropping those fuckers from the sky. I understand, Kirigiri said with a nod, opening a large portal just behind them. Jiren and Shigaraki turned around and, just as he was about to pass through, the latter shot Chisaki a glare. Make sure to stay out of the way, he said before following Jiren into the wall of black mist. When they had disappeared, Shigaraki's voice came through the comms unit in Chisaki's ear. Kirigiri, we're through. Get started. Yes, sir, he responded and turned his attention to the screens, scanning their faces calmly. Chisaki didn't know what to do with herself, so she just stood behind Kirigiri and watched over his shoulder. After a moment of roaming, Kirigiri's eyes settled on one of the panels. 3 men were grouped together in the middle of an aisle, crouched over a crate. One of them had a crowbar and was working to lift the lid off the base. Chisaki watched as a black portal appeared under their feet, swallowing 2 of them. The third man's face was contorted in surprise and fear at the sudden disappearance of his compatriots. He stumbled back and dropped the crowbar from his hands. Something caught Chisaki's eye in one of the other panels. It was a view from a camera pointed to show the catwalks near the ceiling. A pair of black portals appeared in the air, releasing the 2 figures, who tumbled through the air in a brutal freefall to their deaths. The men were gathering momentum as they fell, falling faster and faster, until they were nothing more than flailing blurs, and they dropped out of frame within seconds. Back in the first panel, the man's head jerked up violently, and the fear in his expression turned to visceral terror. At first, it was a bit of blur at the top of the image. Then it was a whole lower body. Then the entire two bodies were in frame, and the man on the ground was right below them. They barreled down, and all the man did was stare up, paralyzed by fear. Chisaki wanted to urge him to run, to get out of the way. But she was no better, with her feet glued to the ground and breath hitched in her throat. Just seconds before the bodies hit the ground, she was struck by barely enough sense to close her eyes and turn away. Even if with her eyes squeezed shut, she still saw them clearly. A gruesome mass of blood, bone, and tissue splattered across the aisle. Her stomach seized and her mouth tasted sour as something burned her throat. She refused to turn around and see them dead and crushed by gravity. But her mind was filling in the image on its own, and that was almost worse. It had been too sudden, too quick. That was a life, no two lives, that had just been ended. A deafening bang sounded to her right. She spun around. Nothing was there. "Jurin, a little warning next time." Shigaraki's voice was in her ear. "That hurt like hell. I'd be surprised if that didn't cause some permanent damage to my ears." "Sorry," Jurin's voice said back. "I didn't have time to put on a silencer." She could picture Shigaraki's expression of loathing. "Just tell me you'll put one on," he snarled back. "Will do," Jurin responded. That sound had been a gunshot. Chisaki realized with horror. Suddenly, she turned back to the screen. It was almost involuntary. But she had to know where that shot had landed. It was the man from before, the one who had watched the other two fall to their death. He was collapsed on the floor, with a pool of blood spreading around him, his eyes unfocused and cloudy. Unseeing, unliving, all too dead. She felt her stomach seize again. Next to him were two crushed things made of blood, torn flesh, jagged bone, and bits of cloth. They looked only vaguely human, recognizable only by an odd limb or two that had been spared by the impact. This was brutal, cruel, inhumane. A voice in her head was screaming to make them stop. This was wrong. It went beyond murder. There had to have been a way to stop them without killing them. Why did they have to die? They surely weren't saints, but that didn't merit murder. She thought back to what Shigaraki had said during his plan. She hadn't taken him seriously enough. She hadn't known how horrible this would be. Kurogiri was looking at her, but he didn't say anything, and he turned back around to face the screens. He was going to create more portals. He was going to kill more people in the same way. She had to tell him to stop. Didn't he see how wrong this was? She opened her mouth to voice her opposition, but nothing came out. A squeaky little, choked sound was all she could muster. Kurogiri glanced at her again, impartial and callous. "If you need to throw up, that far corner looks like a good place," he said, still facing the other way. He was no doubt trying to be sympathetic, but Chisaki found that it just sounded condescending and shallow. How could he say that to her? He was killing people, yet he was more concerned with making sure that she threw up in a proper spot. Yet again, she felt her stomach seize, and this time something was clawing its way up her throat. She rushed quickly to the corner of the room, and barely had a second to tear off her mask before a wave of acid and chunky bits spilled out through her mouth. It hit the floor with a wet splattering noise. She retched once more time, then a third and fourth. An eternity later, when her stomach was done emptying itself, she leaned her head against the wall. Her head felt light and hollow, and her torso felt like a lump of lead, like a balloon held to the earth by an unrelenting weight. Her body felt alien and wrong, but she reminded herself that this was nothing when compared to what those people would have felt just a moment before impact. 1 second standing on solid ground, and the next suddenly falling endlessly, knowing that the only thing awaiting you is a hard slam and death. Her stomach seized again. but it had nothing to give. She was breathing hard now. She had to calm down, steady her breathing. If she hyperventilated too much, she would just throw up again. "You doing okay there, kiddo?" It was Jurin in the comms. How much of that had he heard? That was disgusting. "You should have at least spared us the ear-retching spectacle and taken off your fucking earpiece," Shigaraki said. "Can't even handle a little blood," he muttered. "Honestly, you really are a disgrace." Chizaki wrenched the speaker out of her ear and threw it on the floor. She didn't want to have to deal with his bullshit. What did he mean, a disgrace? He'd just killed. She looked up at the screens, scanning, counting the corpses. He'd just killed at least 12 people. She was the disgrace. He had just brutally murdered over a dozen people for absolutely no reason. Unnecessary death made him a pig, not mature. A little voice in her head told her that she had no experience, and that she didn't have any grounds to base this off of. She didn't care. It was wrong. She found Shigaraki on the screen, standing between two rows of shelves. He had his hand on a man's throat, barely raising him off the ground. Muscles had begun to show and decay under Shigaraki's touch, the skin flaking off in bits of dust. That must have been some side effect of his quirk. She didn't have time to care. The little shit was about to add to the body count. There was a flicker of movement behind him, an eye blinking, a face peeking around the corner at the end of the row. Someone was there. He could easily sneak up on Shigaraki and kill him before Kurogiri even noticed that he existed. Shigaraki could die. She wasn't about to get her earpiece back to warn him. No. If she was going to say anything to that psychopathic brat, it would be to his face. A little piece of black metal shone in the corner of the panel, just a few feet away from Shigaraki. Chisaki assumed that the man Shigaraki was currently torturing must have dropped it. Perfect. That would make for a decent weapon. "Kurogiri," she said forcefully, pointing to the panel. "Take me there." He turned around to face her, his eyes wide in surprise. "Please," she said insistently. He blinked twice and quickly summoned the portal. "What are you planning to do?" he asked, his eyes watching her in concern. She met his eyes, but didn't respond. Instead, she fastened her mask around her face and stepped through the portal. Once through, she was facing Shigaraki and stood only an arm's length away from him, the dying man dangling lifelessly in his hand. Shigaraki's eyes immediately went wide in surprise. "What the hell are you doing here?" he exclaimed, glaring at Chisaki indignantly. But Chisaki didn't react. Her attention had shifted elsewhere. Yes, just at her feet was what she had glimpsed on the screen, a small handgun. She picked it up, flashing her eyes in Shigaraki's direction. Just behind him now, less than 6 feet away from her, was the man she had seen crouching behind the row. He was standing, his arm half raised, a gun in hand. She didn't give him a chance to react. She aimed, braced, and fired. He buckled quickly as the bullet buried into his left leg. He was on the ground, immediately hollering in pain, his gun falling beyond his reach. "Fuck! You fucking bitch!" "Oh, shut up," she said coldly. "Stay quiet and you'll live." Shigaraki's head spun to look over his shoulder at the man, shocked. His eyes darted to Chisaki, then back to the man, and between them a few more times, almost as if he couldn't believe his own eyes. Chisaki's ears rang and her shoulder throbbed. But she couldn't focus on that. There was still a man dying in Shigaraki's hands. "Shigaraki, drop him," she said, shifting the barrel to face him instead. Shigaraki's eyebrows raised in startled amusement, and a small smile stretched across his lips. "Are you going to shoot me?" She stared at him, and, for just a moment, it occurred to her to do just that, but "No," she said, lowering the gun. "Just let the poor man go. He's passed out from the pain. He's not going to hurt you. You don't need to kill him." "Maybe I want to kill him," Shigaraki said, his grin growing. "Has that occurred to you?" that I might enjoy this. She stared at him, a new wave of fiery rage rushing through her veins. Then, maybe I can still shoot you. I'll just shoot your arms until you're forced to let go. Fine, fine, he said, his red eyes trained on her as he released his grip on the man. He crashed to the floor in a stiff pile. Now that he was on the ground, Chisaki could see the damage Shigaraki had caused. He'd left a gruesome wound all along the man's nape and collar. She could see the muscle and blood glistening on his neck from where the skin had been turned to ash. The skin that hadn't fallen off had cracked and left bloody fissured, snaking all along the man's visible skin. You know, I didn't think that you could get angry, Shigaraki said, smiling widely, drawing her attention back to him. It was a wolfish, almost repulsive thing, a grin that displayed his yellowed teeth and stretched his pale, chapped lips farther than she would have thought possible. She glared at him. You ended more than 12 lives today. Her tone sharpened, quickly growing low and accusatory. You and your stupid plan brutally murdered more than a dozen people, and it wasn't even necessary. You were never in any immediate danger. There was never a reason to kill them. You could have just as easily had Kurogiri send them somewhere else, somewhere far away from here. Hey, I'm going to bleed out down here. The man on the floor interrupted. Girlie, you don't want me to die, now do you? He was watching her with indignant, beady little eyes. Chisaki glared at him and was about to respond when Shigaraki beat her to it. Shut it, you old croak, or you'll lose another leg. He snarled with a tilt of his head, his eyes still fixed on Chisaki. Maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to risk them coming back. Her eyes shot back to the pale man before her, her blood boiling. Then invest in better security. People don't have to die for them to leave you alone. He raised his eyebrows again and then narrowed his eyes. You like your heroism and your justice, right? His eyes were boring into her, probing for a reaction. So tell me, what if people like these leave us alone, but not the next person they come across? What if they decide to attack an old woman or a defenseless child next? What would you do then? Chisaki glared back stubbornly. He had a point. When put into that perspective, his actions almost made sense. But this whole idea was a very slippery slope. I don't know. She shook her head resolutely, furrowing her brow. But we can't just go around killing every person to ever inconvenience us. If everyone did, that society would still be in the feudal ages. He watched her for a second, red eyes narrowed and analyzing. Chisaki stared back defiantly, studying him in return. He had a cold intelligence in his eyes. Maybe that's what had intrigued her. He had always been so bored and aloof that she had assumed that he didn't care about others, that he didn't look twice at a person. Maybe she had been wrong. What that fuck are you two pansies doing? I'm bleeding, oh. They both turned to the man on the floor with fire in their eyes. We told you to shut up, they roared at once. Their eyes shot back up to meet each other. Shigaraki grinned. Chisaki glared and looked away. If you're planning to do anything with this prick, you should do it now, he said, raising a pale eyebrow. Jurin should be just about done finishing off whoever's left. A cold feeling settled in Chisaki's gut. Right, more people had died while she had been here debating. Can Kurogiri drop these two off at a hospital? She asked, her eyes softening as they landed on the unconscious man with the neck wound. Shigaraki's grin dropped an inch. That sounds like a really shitty idea. But yeah, it should be doable. He paused for a second and cocked his head, listening to something Chisaki couldn't hear. Jurin's done, he informed. Kurogiri'll take us home. Just then a black portal appeared next to them, as they were about to step through. Wait, what about me? Exclaimed the man on the floor. Chisaki spun around. This prick. You heard my friend before. We'll get you to a fucking hospital, Shigaraki said with a glare over his shoulder, before grabbing Chisaki's arm, careful to only use 4 fingers. let's go," he said as he pulled her through with him. Chisaki and Shigaraki emerged from the portal and found themselves returned to the camera room. Kurogiri and Jurin stood opposite them. The former stood waiting attentively, while the latter leaned against the table with his arms crossed over his chest. Jurin straightened upon seeing them arrive and Kurogiri. "Hey, you're alive," he said with a toothy grin. "Good to see that neither of you got too roughed up." Shigaraki rolled his eyes and didn't answer. Instead, he detached himself from Chisaki's side and strolled up to Kurogiri. "Let's get home," he began, his lips set in a vaguely pensive smile. "I need to talk to Sensei," he said with a glance over his shoulder at Chisaki. "Shigaraki," she said, frowning. "Don't forget about them." "Right, the hospital," he interrupted, amusement flickering in his eyes behind his hand mask. "She insists that we take the two men downstairs to a hospital instead of killing them." Kurogiri furrowed his non-existent brow, his eyes shifting between Shigaraki and Chisaki. "If you authorize it, I will. Just keep in mind the possible repercussions." "Yeah," Shigaraki said with a grin and a wave of a hat. "It'll be fine. We'll have to transfer everything to another warehouse anyways." "Understood," Kurogiri responded with a bow of his head. "Will the local hospital 2 towns overdue?" Shigaraki shrugged and Chisaki gave a nod. One of the monitors showed the 2 men being swallowed by one of Kurogiri's portals. She let loose a sigh of relief. Finally, they were on their way to somewhere safe. Shigaraki raised an eyebrow at her. "What are you looking so content for?" She stared at him for a moment and cocked her head. "What do you mean? Why shouldn't I be happy?" An eerie grin spread across his lips. Kurogiri could have easily sent them somewhere other than a hospital, somewhere dangerous. But here you are, so certain that you've won. His grin only grew when he saw her surprise. "Do you really trust us that much?" That thought hadn't even crossed her mind. "Why, yeah, I guess I do," she said with wide eyes. "Well, stop it," he said with a snort. "That kind of unfounded trust will get you killed." He turned around to say something to Kurogiri. Chisaki found herself staring at him again in bewilderment. When had she started to trust them? Shouldn't she be repulsed? Hadn't they just killed a dozen people? Why wasn't she more angry? "Kiddo?" Jurin asked, touching her shoulder. She looked up suddenly. "Why, you okay?" he asked. "I heard from Kurogiri that you went storming out of here earlier, right after throwing up, and then we couldn't contact you." She gave a shallow smile. "I'm fine." Her eyes darted guiltily to the corpses displayed on the monitors. "I don't feel like I should be, but I'm fine now." "Ah," Jurin responded, giving a knowing nod upon following her gaze. "Yeah, that takes a while to get used to." She frowned. I don't plan to get used to it." He sighed and gave her a small smile. "Sometimes I can't help but wonder why such a kind girl like you ended up with us." "Jurin, Chisaki, let's go," Kurogiri interjected from a few feet away. A warp gate hovered beside him. "Where's Shigaraki?" Chisaki asked, not seeing the third villain. "He's already back home. He wanted to talk to Sensei for a moment," Kurogiri supplied. "Oh, okay," Chisaki said as she approached the portal, surprised that she hadn't noticed the development. A minute later, and the 3 of them were standing back in the bar. Kurogiri sighed, closed his warp gate, and circled the bar, ready to resume his glass polishing duties. Jurin and Chisaki took seats at the bar. They sat for a minute in silence. "Hey, Kurogiri," Jurin said after a second. "Do you think that you could ask your boss to raise my salary?" "Not really," he responded flatly. "Why?" "Well, you guys have me running around and doing all of these high-risk missions without notice, and I'm still getting paid the exact same amount as before." "Oh, you're getting paid?" Chisaki asked, surprised. "Of course." I mean, man has to live off of something, right? Does that mean that you also get paid, Kurogiri? Chisaki asked, turning to the bartender curiously. No, he said coolly. Since I live and work here, I just share funds with the league and don't actually get paid. I see, she said, smiling. So Shigaraki's the same way. Kind of. He began, grinning slightly, as if he found the idea amusing. But it's more like a parent-child relationship. Since Shigaraki is the boss successor, it's only natural that they provide for him. He furrowed his brow in concern. Chisaki had gone stiff at his words. Chisaki, are you okay? She just stared at him in disbelief. Shigaraki is Sensei's protege? She asked breathlessly. Yeah, Jurin said with a raised eyebrow, barely suppressing a laugh. You didn't know? She stared dumbly at the countertop. And no, of course not. How was I supposed to know that? A realization hit her. The blood drained from her freckled cheeks, and she looked up to her companions in panic. Kurogiri, I almost shot the next leader of the league. What do I do? Sensei's going to hate me. I'm going to die. What am I going to do? The bartender watched her overreaction humorously. How nice it must have been to be that young and have that much energy, especially after such an eventful day. A voice suddenly came from the TV above them, startling Chisaki out her panicked ramblings. Kurogiri, I need to speak with Chisaki. Could you please send her to me? We have something very important to discuss. That voice was unmistakably Sensei, and Chisaki was certain that he sounded royally pissed off. But it was the kind of royally pissed off that was preceded by a large, secretly threatening smile. Kurogiri set down the glass he had been cleaning and, ignoring Chisaki's incessant cries to the contrary, he opened the portal to Sensei's office. In you go, Chisaki. No, Kurogiri, how could you do this to me? She exclaimed. She quickly turned to Jurin in her last-ditch attempt to save herself. Jurin, please, you must know some trick. How can I get out of here? He tilted his head mournfully. Sorry, kiddo. I'm afraid this is inevitable, he said, playing along, but almost breaking character as tears burst into Chisaki's green eyes. Kurogiri rolled his eyes. Oh, calm down. It's not that big of a deal. Just get in the portal. And no, she exclaimed, leaning away. Fine, Kurogiri said, much to Chisaki's surprise. Her relief was immediately rescinded, however, when she noticed that she was sinking. She looked down to find that a warp gate had been placed directly below her chair and was swallowing both her and her stool. Kurogiri, she exclaimed in outrage. You traitor. Kurogiri just shrugged. Don't worry, kiddo, Jurin said, grinning down at her as she sank in up to her ankles. You'll be fine. Fine? What do you mean, fine? She hollered before she was completely swallowed by the black portal. She popped out the other end, and for a second she thought that she was falling, before her stool connected with the ground. It teetered for a moment and Chisaki let out a startled yelp, her arms flailing around her in order to regain balance. Someone cleared their throat, and she looked up. Kurogiri had landed her directly in front of Sensei and his big throne of machinery. He smiled down at her in something between amusement and astonishment at the sudden appearance of a girl on a stool. Sensei, hi. She began while giving him a nervous smile. Hello, Chisaki. How kind of you to bring your own chair, he said, smiling the smile of secret death. I wanted to talk to you about what happened at the warehouse. All right, so Shigaraki must have told you about it, she said, looking away nervously. Why do you sound so hesitant? Are you feeling all right? Why, yes, I'm fine, she exclaimed. Okay, he said dubiously, leaning his head on his hand. How about you tell me about your sudden decision to jump through a warp gate and engage yourself in an active combat zone? Well, sir. Sir. Sensei, I was. Her lips stretched into a thin-lipped frown as she recalled the moment. I was terrified, Sensei. At first, I thought that maybe I could handle the combat, that I was ready to witness the death. After all, it's not like I personally knew any of these criminals, but just standing by and watching people die, it goes against every fiber in my being. I couldn't just stand there, I got angry. So, when I saw an opportunity to save a life, I took it. Even though it impeded the execution of the mission, he said, raising what would have been an eyebrow. I didn't really think about the mission, she said, her face turning red. Just what was happening in front of me. I was focused on the human life being extinguished without just cause. That sounds a lot like something a hero would say. Don't you think? Really? That hadn't occurred to me, she said sheepishly, suddenly embarrassed by the comparison. A moment passed in which Sensei seemed to be studying her face thoughtfully, and she studied his in trying to understand what he was thinking, or how he was going to react next. Chizaki, it's occurred to me before that maybe you might want to be a vigilante hero. It would come more naturally to someone with such a kind heart as yours. And no, she blurted out, before suddenly remembering herself and speaking more quietly. Even if I were strong enough to work as a vigilante, I wouldn't want to leave. As much as I might disagree with Shigaraki's brutal methods, I really can't help thinking that this world needs changing. Heroes are figureheads who pander to hollow ideals. It doesn't matter how good their intentions may be, the hero society ultimately corrupts and treads thoughtlessly on those they don't have a use for. It crowns violent fanatics with explosive quirks as prodigies and leaders, while people with no control of their circumstances are marginalized. People who have to hide their pain behind smiles and "oh, I'm projecting, aren't I? Sorry," she exclaimed, her face suddenly flashing red in embarrassment. What I meant to say was this. She took a deep breath and composed herself. Sensei, if you're still willing to have me in the league, I would like to stay and earn a place here. A small laugh escaped his lips. Oh, Chisaki, I don't know whether to reward or admonish you, Sensei said as he steepled his fingers in contemplation. On one hand, it's refreshing to see you remain true to your ideals and sense of justice, which is something that cannot be said for most people in this industry. On the other hand, you have not only put yourself in danger, but also risked Shigaraki's own well-being. What a conundrum. He tilted his head to the side and spoke partially over his shoulder. What do you want to do, Shigaraki? Shigaraki? He was here? The young man stepped out from behind the throne, still decorated in his dismembered hands, and his calculating red eyes watching Chisaki in scrutiny. Her face flushed red again. Had he been listening the whole time? She was pretty sure that she's called his methods brutal. If he heard, he didn't comment. After a moment he said, I think that she should play a game as punishment. Something to test her resolve. A grin stretched across his lips. Recently, there's been a certain gang that's been getting full of themselves and acting out of line. In 2 months, you and I will both lead opposing sides of a pincer attack on their base. If you succeed in reaching the base and meeting up with me and my team without killing a single person, you can keep operating as you please. But if you fail and your team kills someone, then you'll have to work by my rules, he said, cocking his head and grinning wider. She didn't even blink. I'll do it, she said immediately. She hadn't even given herself time to think it over. But if it meant that she could redeem herself and prove to him that murder was not the only way of solving problems, then it was worth it. Shigaraki, Sensei began. I'm fine with you two competing, but won't Chisaki be at a huge disadvantage? She has no quirk, has no combat experience, is not trained, and has never managed a group of villains before. Normally, I wouldn't mind the difference in experience or power. But this operation that you want to wager on is dangerous. If Chisaki were to fail in even completing the basic objectives and subdue the gang, then your side would have a much bigger issue on its hands, Shigaraki. Shigaraki grinned. Well, We can easily resolve 2 of those issues within 2 months. Jurin and Kurjiri can train her. But for the other one, a conspiratorial look flashed in his eyes. Sensei, would you be willing to give Chisaki a quirk? The older villain raised an eyebrow and turned to face the bewildered girl on the stool, studying her anew. She must have misheard them. Right. There was no way that they could have been talking about an actual quirk. There was no way to collect and give quirks. Unless that was an actual quirk. Yes, Sensei said after a moment. But I'll need some time to properly prepare one. And she'll need at least 2 weeks in order to adjust to it. This quirk thing, Chisaki began in excitement. Is it part of a quirk? Is that what your quirk is, Sensei? Shigaraki let out a husky wheeze. Chisaki thought that it might be what passed as a laugh from him. At least it looked to be from the way he was holding his sides. You didn't know about Sensei's quirk? Apparently, I don't know anything, she said, frowning. Shigaraki let out another stream of wheezes. Oh God, you joined without knowing anything? You must really be a naive idiot. I'm not an idiot, she exclaimed defensively. I may be a little. Well, maybe really naive, but I'm not. It's okay, Chisaki, Sensei said, sighing. She thought for a moment that he might be rolling his eyes at his childish successor. My quirk is called All for One. It allows me to strip away people's quirks, use them, and give them to other people. I don't blame you for not knowing. You and I never got around to talking about my quirk, and with everything that's been happening to you, I'm not surprised that we never discussed all the secrets of the League. Well, is there anything else that I should know? She asked, biting her lip. Something clawed its way from the back of her mind. I think some project got mentioned earlier, just before we left. The Namu project. Does that sound right? Sensei raised an eyebrow and Shigaraki stopped laughing. How do you remember that but not know about All for One? Shigaraki asked, eyes narrowed. I don't know, maybe because no one ever told me about Sensei's quirk, she murmured. Sensei chuckled. Well, I'm certainly impressed. That project is absolutely critical for our future plans. Using All for One, we're creating beings capable of holding multiple quirks, he said evenly. The screens behind Chisaki flashed to show the lab she had previously caught glimpses of on the screens. She turned around to find that at least 24 rows of 6 tanks, each stretched across the screens. Frankenstein-ash muscular, black, bird-like things with exposed brains were suspended inside of each tank. Though their eyes were closed, and they appeared to be asleep, Chisaki couldn't help but find the thought of them moving at least a little terrifying. What are they? She asked breathlessly. The Namu, Sensei said evenly. She could feel his eyes boring into the back of her head. He was looking for some kind of a reaction. While the creatures were entirely unnerving and disgusting, she didn't want Sensei thinking that she couldn't even handle the sight of his monsters. His disappointment would have been too crushing. How are you going to use them? She asked as she turned around, curiosity in her eyes. Well, we're going to start by using them to kill All Might, Shigaraki said, his lips twisted into a smile, excited at the prospect. Chisaki couldn't help but wonder if he held his own grudge against the number 1 hero. Ultimately, the hope is to use them to overturn the Hero Society and their order. But yes, we are going to start with All Might, Sensei said. It'll show the world just how shallow and useless the heroes ultimately are. Chisaki didn't know how to respond for a second. This plan sounded violent, but world change wouldn't come from kind words and platitudes. She would just have to harden her heart and get used to such concepts and the methods used to employ them. Right? She said with a nod, refusing to betray that the idea had bothered her. Sensei watched her for a moment, as if he had expected a reaction from her. She smiled inwardly. She was getting used to this. Do you have any more questions? Sensei asked, eyes watching her intently. No, she said, tilting her head to the side and trying to think. Though I'm sure that think of some later. That's fine. Don't hesitate to ask Kurogiri or Shigaraki if anything else occurs to you. Chisaki gave a nod. She would be sure to hound them with every question that occurred to her. Well, if that's it, Shigaraki said, pulling the hand off his face. I have a guild match to get to, he said as he walked away. He held up the decapitated hand over his shoulder and gave a brief wave as he disappeared through a door. I'm sure that you're exhausted, Chisaki. Sensei began, slipping into a warm smile as he turned back to her. I'll call Kurogiri and he can take you home. Okay? She relaxed and smiled even wider. Thank you for the talk today. I was actually really worried about what you might say regarding what happened at the warehouse, she admitted, tilting her head and giving a nervous laugh. You didn't need to be, Sensei said, humorously. I found it entertaining to hear that someone actually stood up to my protege. Most people would have been too intimidated by his personality to speak their mind. She found herself stifling a laugh at the little dig at the once intimidating villain. I like the gas mask, by the way. It's a nice, slightly sinister touch to the bartender outfit. Thank you, Sensei, Chisaki responded. Her cheeks were starting to hurt from smiling so much. Sir, Kurogiri said, suddenly appearing next to a vortex. Kurogiri, he said, can you please get Chisaki home? She deserves to rest after the day she's had. Yes, sir, Kurogiri replied, inclining his head. Is it all right if I take her to the bar first? I'm sure that she'll want to change her clothes and collect her belongings. Of course, he said. I'll see you again soon, Chisaki, he said as she stood to leave. We still have to get you that quirk after all. Right, thank you, Sensei. After that, things blurred. Kurogiri returned her to the bar, where Chisaki changed out of her costume, picked up her things, and was ferried back to her neighborhood park. When she finally stumbled her way into her still empty apartment, her phone read 11 p.m., and the adrenaline and shock from the night's events had begun to fade. Exhaustion caught up to her, and she collapsed into her bed, where she passed out, still fully dressed.